This video is going to give you an overview of every leader of the People's Republic of China from 1949 until today. So from Mao Zedong until Xi Jinping. That's going to require us to spend a little extra time talking about Mao Zedong because he is the founder of modern China. He is the man by which all other leaders of China must be compared. There's this cliche that Plato is the philosopher by which everyone after Plato is merely a footnote on his philosophy. In this case, for China, every leader after Mao, that is our mystery man, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Jintao, and then Xi Jinping, are basically answers to Mao Zedong and his leadership. So we definitely have to start with him. Mao Zedong was born in 1893. He was born to a relatively well-off peasant farmer, and he is born and comes of age at a time when the Qing dynasty, the dynasty that had ruled China since 1644, was coming to its end. It's often characterized as a collapse, but it is a process that takes time. And Xi is in his teenage years when the Republic of China is proclaimed by Sun Yat-sen in 1912. He even spends a little bit of time in the Revolutionary Army of Sun Yat-sen. And I have here a biography by Jonathan Spence on Mao Zedong, and he talks a little bit about his intellectual background. So Mao Zedong was introduced to the accomplishments of Napoleon, of Catherine the Great, Wellington, Gladstone, Rousseau, Montesquieu, Washington, Lincoln. He also would have read the work of Adam Smith, of Darwin, John Stuart Mill, and of course China's very own Confucius. Now, none of those people that I just listed there are socialists or Marxists, so you might be wondering how this great Mao Zedong, this Marxist leader of China, ended up becoming one with the Marxist Party. And the answer to that question is that he was surely aware of socialism in this revolutionary era. So let's describe the founding of modern China, or rather the founding of the Republic of China, 1912 until 1920. Mao Zedong is going through a period in which revolutionary ideas are simply everywhere, and the youth of China are simply exploring different ways to change their society, to get it out of its backwardness. It's actually a little murky how Mao Zedong comes to socialism, but we do know that in 1920, he actually did some writing in which he argued with the idea that Leninist Marxism, that is the Marxism that is Bolshevik in nature, that was used in 1917 in Russia, in what was called Petrograd, to bring the Bolsheviks to power, would not be applicable to the conditions of China. And so actually the first take we have of Mao Zedong is that he doesn't think that Lenin's style of Marxism would go over well in China. And we'll talk a little bit about the theory about why he thought that was true in just a moment. But the point is that we don't know exactly what took place, but in 1921, Mao Zedong becomes one of the founding members of the Communist Party of China. In fact, he becomes an elected member to its central committee. So how did this take place? Well, the Bolshevik revolutionaries in Russia were internationalists. That is to say, revolution to a Marxist, generally speaking at this time, is not one that takes place in a single country necessarily, but rather it is like a domino, a set of dominoes towards international workers' revolution. The proletariat rises up, the working class rises up, and the actual lines of nation states aren't that important. And so after the Bolsheviks consolidate power through the Russian Civil War, they're looking to instigate these revolutions around the world. And so they form something called the Communist International. And Lenin's Comintern, let me write that down, the Communist International, the Comintern, starts to operate inside of Shanghai in about 1920 to 1921. And this is when Mao joins its central committee. And he starts to organize and agitate and becomes a Marxist. It is through the funding of the Russians, of the Soviets that this is possible. However, there is a tactic that is being advocated by the Bolsheviks, by Moscow, effectively, in Shanghai, with which Mao Zedong does not agree. And this is crazy coincidence. I'm over here grabbing another book, but my girlfriend actually bought me this book at a rare book sale just about a week ago, of all things, here in Washington, D.C. It was in the basement, and you can even see the price tag on it. It was $5. It's called Missionaries of Revolution, Soviet Advisors and Nationalist China 1920 to 1927. So this is basically a book based on stolen documents from the Soviet embassy in Beijing in 1927. And I'm going to open up the book now because there is a section in which Mao Zedong disagrees with Soviet policy. Now, he's written in this book as Mao Zedong. That's another way of anglicizing his name. But there was this heated debate and on this policy. So there's this, I'm going to make a cut here. It's hard to hold a mic and a book at the same time. New policies were contained in blah, blah, blah report to the Congress. In the heated debate that ensued, several people, including Mao Zedong, were opposed. Now, what was it that Mao Zedong was opposed to? It was opposition to joining an institution called the Kuomintang. This is often anglicized as KMT or Kuomintang. So there we go, KMT. Kuomintang is how I'm going to use language when describing them, but you'll often see it written as KMT. This is ostensibly a Chinese nationalist party, though its revolutionary founder, Sun Yat-sen, has some affinity for the work of Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union. It's also the case that even though the Soviet Union, the international Comintern, has started to build a communist party in China, in Shanghai in this period, that it's a ragtag group. It's small. And China is a big country. And so the Comintern advises the Chinese communists to join up with a larger institution. At this time, China, at the collapse of the Qing Empire, has basically descended into regionalism. It's often called the warlords period, in which basically people are operating fiefdoms all over the country. China is, at this moment in time, far, far more rural, and as we'll see as we go through this video, will remain far, far more rural than urban. And so what is happening is that some power that is capable of potentially reunifying this massive, massive country is an organization perhaps worth allying with. And the fact is, at the time, the KMT, the Kuomintang, was an organization that was dedicated to unifying the country of China under the yoke of the Kuomintang, bringing it into warlordism. And they also, because they had this sort of left-wing affinity, or at least, at the very least, the revolutionary leader Sun Yat-sen had expressed some admiration for Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik Revolution, the Comintern instructed the Chinese communists to join the Kuomintang. So what we have is the United Front of 1923. Let's see if that's still on the camera, to 1927. This is when the Chinese communists of Shanghai join the KMT, the Kuomintang. And it's called the United Front. Will later be called the First United Front. We'll see why. But the purpose of this period, of these 4 years, for the Kuomintang ostensibly, is to unify China under the authority of Sun Yat-sen. For the communists, the idea is to get into the ranks of this organization that is a mass organization and have an effect on the membership and their politics. That is, recruit people to be communists from within the organization. Now, the reason that Mao Zedong was likely opposed to this policy, as we saw in the book that I just read from, it's not stated exactly why he opposed it, but we can take some guesses. One is that the KMT was not a communist organization. It was certainly not an international communist organization. So perhaps it was a question of intellectual purity as to why Mao Zedong opposed being part of it. The other reason, of course, is that it's a big risk, right? You're infiltrating an organization and trying to win people over to your cause from within. If things don't go your way, the idea that you might be purged or killed is extremely high. Nonetheless, I'm going to make a cut here and I'm going to show you a photo of Mao Zedong following orders. 1 second. Okay, so I'm going to edit this into the video, but basically this is an image of Mao Zedong. You can see there in the middle row, third from the right, there he is, Mao Zedong, as it's anglicized in this book, in the third plenum of the Kuomintang Central Executive Committee meeting in 1927. Now, 1927 is an interesting year to have this photograph because this is the year when everything would change for the United Front, or as it will henceforth be called, the First United Front, because naturally it falls apart in 1927. An upstart named Chiang Kai-shek rises to the leadership after the death of Sun Yat-sen and the Kuomintang, and the party takes a decided turn to the conservative, to the right. In addition, Chiang Kai-shek takes umbrage at the fact that the communists are recruiting from within their organization, and so he begins a purge of all the communists, and they start, the Kuomintang do, to pursue the communists throughout the cities of China. Now, what happens next is that the communists obviously retreat, and they go out into rural areas of China to raise peasant armies to oppose the Kuomintang. They say, okay, time for plan B. People like Mao Zedong go out in the country. They say, we're going to find a way to resist the Kuomintang. We're going to lick our wounds. We're going to spend some time away. The problem, of course, is that the Kuomintang is not so interested in just letting the communists go off. And so they pursue them out into rural areas. And this kicks off the Chinese Civil War, or at least the first phase of the Chinese Civil War from 1927 until 1936, or sometimes 37-ish. Okay? So the Chinese Civil War kicks off in this period between the now right-leaning nationalist Kuomintang and a hodgepodge group of peasant armies led by the communists, including Mao Zedong. Now, the problem, of course, is that the communists are on the back foot, and the nationalists have the strong upper hand. After all, they've been going through China already, unifying the country, winning over warlords or coercing warlords to join their cause. They start to put the communists on the back foot almost immediately. The communists are forced into a smaller and smaller area, and by 1935, 1936, their forces are dwindled down to the tens of thousands. And this is the period of time, 34, 35. This is when you hear about the Long March, which is ultimately the long retreat of Mao and other communists to safe areas in what we would call today the north of China, discounting places like Upper Manchuria. If Chiang Kai-shek had wanted to end the communists in this moment, he probably could have, but he doesn't. History intervenes. And this is when we need to talk about Japan. There's, clean the board now, there's this little old doodly in history. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. It's called World War II. Technically, it did not start in 1937, unless, of course, you include Japan's invasion of China, its full-scale invasion of China, which kicks off about 1936, 1937. Of course, for most of the world, World War II kicks off with Hitler's invasion of Poland, but in this case, China is going to start resisting one of the Axis powers a couple years before the rest of the world jumps into World War II. Perhaps it's Eurocentrism that we don't consider Japan's invasion of China the official kickoff of World War II. Nonetheless, Japan senses weakness. Imperial Japan sees the fall of the Qing Empire. It sees the nationalists trying to and the Kuomintang trying to unify China. And of course, it sees the fighting, the civil war between the nationalists and the communists, and thinks, it seems like a great opportunity to expand our empire into China. And of course, the things the Japanese did in China during World War II are absolutely horrific. That goes well beyond just invasion into things like war crimes, etc. We're not going to be able to get into that here. However, the thing that's relevant for us to know, of course, is that the two main combatants of the Civil War, the two belligerents, the Kuomintang and the communists, they decide at this moment, maybe we should hang it up for a second, right? And fight Japan that's invading. Because if Japan takes China, neither of us get to wield power. Neither the Kuomintang nor the communists. And so what we get is the second united front between the Kuomintang and the communists that lasts from 1937 until 1945. Now, the way it's formed, there's a lot of politicking and things that go on. We don't have time to get into that here, but the main point is that the communists and the nationalists decide, okay, let's join forces and fight the invading Japanese. Now, there's a lot of subtlety here, and there's a lot of mixed history, and even in all the books that I've read on this period, or books that I haven't read, books specific on this period, books that address this period, there is a lot that we still don't know about exactly what went on. And part of that is just because there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of chaos. The point being that this Second United Front, though it technically lasts until 1945, starts to fall apart pretty quickly. The reason being that both the Kuomintang and the communists want to position themselves to be ready in case Japan is defeated, so that if Japan is defeated, that either the Kuomintang or the communists can have a advantageous position to start a new phase of the Civil War and actually win. And so you have both sides angling to try to strengthen themselves to be in an advantageous position after the war against Japan is over. One side does this better than the other. And since we know that Mao Zedong is the first leader of unified China, and that China today is ostensibly a communist country, we know who actually does this politicking and maneuvering during the war against Japanese aggression better than the other. Mao Zedong in particular, who is stuck up in this isolated northerly region, Yan'an, with like tens of thousands of soldiers, finds a way to both fight the Japanese, theoretically, while also building a force between 1937 and 1945 that numbered likely in the hundreds of thousands at the very least, and some estimates say rose to 1 million. So you'd expect that if both the nationalists and the communists are fighting Imperial Japan, that they're both going to be weakened, and then they're going to fight each other on that basis after Japan is defeated. What actually happens is that the nationalists are defeated, the communists are strengthened, and then they fight after the defeat of Japan on that basis. Kind of crazy. But before we talk about the end of the Chinese Civil War, we do need to talk about what Mao Zedong was up to in this period, because he was doing some work to consolidate his grip on the Communist Party of China. At the start of the Civil War, Mao Zedong is one of the leading communists, but he is not the leading communist. However, under the cover of World War II and this resistance of Japan, Mao Zedong rises to be a Stalinist figure, a one-man band leading the front of what would be the Chinese Communist Party that would emerge from World War II and take ultimate power in China. This is the period in time in which Mao Zedong does two things. One is he begins to lay the intellectual foundations for Marxism with Chinese characteristics. There is a problem in Marxism if you are what we would call a quote-unquote third world country, an undeveloped country, in Marxist language, a backwards country. That problem is that in Marx's vision of how history develops, countries like Great Britain, the United States, countries with industrialization are going to be the first to have proletarian revolutions because they're going to have a working class in the cities, working in factories, for example, that are going to raise their class consciousness and then start their revolutions. Now, the first time this issue was addressed was, of course, in Russia, the first country to have a Marxist revolution. Russia had way more peasants than it did working class in its society. Russia was a non-industrialized country at the time of its revolution. Lenin and the Bolsheviks had to find a way to address this issue. And one of the ways, and I'm going to butcher the theory a little bit, but just to keep it shorthand, the idea was that Lenin and the Bolsheviks led a vanguard party. They led what did exist of the working class and the proletarians to power, to take power for the Soviets in October 1917 in Russia. And then they brought in the peasants afterwards, basically as allies, to help them industrialize, collectivize, build socialism, and then in the Marxist telling, eventually socialism, the state falls away. Through state planning basically leads to this ideal society in which everything's distributed according to need. The state falls away and we have communism. Okay, so let's try to adapt that into China. Mao saw things a little bit differently. Lenin says proletarian party, vanguard party, top-down revolution. Mao starts to formulate a revolution, and this is theoretical, but a Chinese revolution that is bottom-up. Because of the vast peasantry of China, the revolution would need to be done by the peasantry themselves. Conveniently, he's out in the rural area with a bunch of peasants trying to lead them and trying to give them a philosophy that they can grab onto and join him. Now, I have a quote here actually from Mao Zedong. He writes in his report on the... I got to make a cut. I got to find this quote. I've got all these notes and I just... here it is. His 1927 report on the peasant movement. Quote, "Poor peasants are always the main force of the revolution, ... and they are the most responsive to communist leadership." So basically, Mao is saying that the revolution should be bottom up from the peasants. Now, you'll notice a contradiction in the fact that the peasants are leading the revolution from the bottom up, but are simultaneously responsive to Communist Party leadership. Let's not get into the contradictions here for the second. Let's just accept Mao's premise as it stands. This is what will morph into the idea of socialism with Chinese characteristics in the following decades. At this moment in time, it's framed as the adaptation of Marxism to the realities on the ground, the material realities, to use Marxist phrasing, in China. It's sometimes called the Sinification of Marxism. Sino, if you don't know, is used as a pretext, pretext or a prefix, in the English language. Sino is a prefix for China. So xenophobia, S-I-N-O phobia, xenophobia is the fear of China, right? Sinification is the Chineseification. So the Sinification of Marxism is the Chineseification of Marxism. For the case of Mao, it's about bottom-up revolution. And the reason I'm emphasizing this point so much is because Mao is going to use this bottom-up model to great effect over the course of decades. He does it in the Cultural Revolution. He's going to try to use it in the Great Leap Forward a little bit before that. But for our purposes right now, during World War II, under the cover of the Second United Front against the Japanese War of Aggression, what the Chinese Communist Party will eventually call the Anti-Fascist War against Japanese aggression, Mao Zedong is going to, for the first time, put this bottom-up revolutionary attitude into practice in what is called the Rectification Campaign. Rectification Campaign, sometimes called the movement. You can translate it however you want. It runs from roughly 1941 to the end of World War II, 1945. Now, ostensibly, this is about taking all of these brand new peasants that are joining the communist ranks and giving them a basis of Marxist-Leninism. What most would actually argue it is Mao Zedong consolidating his power into the paramount leader of the Chinese Communist Party, undisputed. So what goes on during this rectification campaign? Well, there is thought reform. There is a fight against dogmatism. There is a need for people who are rivals of Mao Zedong to do self-criticisms. And this all sounds like vague gobbledygook, but in practice what it meant was that people had mental torture applied to them at all levels. And generally speaking, it was the people at the bottom that were encouraged to criticize those above them, to abolish rank, to abolish hierarchy, except of course for Mao and his Mao Zedong thought that's being promoted in this period of time. So you have rivals of Mao forced to give elaborate self-criticisms of themselves, to basically lacerate themselves, not literally, but figuratively, in order to prove and explain why they were utter failures at being good communists. And of course, in theory, this is about ideological purity. It's about learning, and that's why some of these things are called like study sessions. But in practice, what's happening is that these people are denouncing themselves. And even when a confession is forced, as will later be the case in the Cultural Revolution, Mao says that a good communist wouldn't confess. And so therefore, the admission of guilt under pressure, under torture, under public humiliation is circularly a true confession. It must be, because if it weren't true, they wouldn't have said it. That's Mao's logic. A little disturbing, a little crazy. The reason I'm bringing this up is because it's going to become very relevant at the latter part of Mao's leadership in China. But let's go ahead and skip ahead to the end of World War II. So in 1948, about 30,000. So Japan is defeated in 1945, right? The Civil War kicks back up between the nationalists and the communists. The communists, as I've just said, emerged the more powerful party. By 1948, they've taken the cities of Nanjing and Beijing, so they've started to take major cities. And the nationalists, this shattered remains of the nationalist forces, are on the constant retreat. 30,000 of those nationalists are flooding over the Taiwan Strait to Taiwan every single day. Taiwan, often called Formosa, that's a name given to it by the Portuguese, beautiful island, is where in 1949, Chiang Kai-shek himself, the leader of the Kuomintang of the nationalists, flees. And this is what ends, effectively, the Chinese Civil War. However, I should say, there's never actually been a declaration of peace to my understanding. So technically, the war continues to this day. If you've seen some of my content on Taiwan over the years, you'll know a little bit more of that history. On October 1st, is it? 1949. Chairman Mao goes into Tiananmen Square. He stands up and he proclaims the People's Republic of China, which he says, quote, represents the will of the whole nation. So let's talk a little bit about the early portion of Mao Zedong's rule. There are a few things going on. First of all, Mao Zedong has to, in 1949, mop up, clean up some of the remnants of resistance. He also needs support, and so he goes to visit old Joseph Stalin, who's now the paramount or the premier, the general secretary in the Soviet Union. And this visit is quite a disaster. We don't have time to go into it in particular, but it lays the foundation of what will later be called the Sino-Soviet split. Basically, Stalin is mean to Mao and makes him wait around, plays some psychological games. However, in the end, he does send a flood of Soviet advisors into the newly formed People's Republic of China to help them Sovietize their economy. And so the first years of Mao Zedong's rule as the paramount leader of the People's Republic of China are properly defined as Soviet in nature. Now, what does it mean to be Soviet in nature? Well, it means a few things. One, it means to place a priority on collective agriculture, land reform, and industrialization. Let's talk about land reform first. In the late 1940s and continuing into the 1950s, there is an effort encouraged by Mao Zedong for poor peasants who are not landowning to expropriate the land of landlords, of landowners, and to apply a revolutionary zeal to those people who were in the ownership class. The middle peasants are effectively categorized as bourgeois enemies of the revolution. And so there is a small respite in the early 1950s, but basically from the time in the 1940s, wherever Mao Zedong was controlling, and then of course that expanded into the whole of China, there was a mass expropriation of landlords from their land to the peasants. This also meant, Mao being Mao, that he encouraged the peasants to truly punish and purvey warfare and true violence upon this class of people that had owned land. And so it's estimated that like 1 million or 2 people died in this process because the peasants didn't just expropriate land from landlords, they would kill them. And I'll try to edit a little photo, a really famous photo up on the screen that shows some of this violence the peasants were perpetrating on landlords. There's also in this period very typical 5-year plans for agricultural and industrialization. That's very Soviet. And then in 1956, Mao Zedong turns the tables on all these peasants that have started to take their own little plot of land for their family. And he says, all private property is now abolished. So you thought you owned land, but it's time for you to fit into a collectivized farm. These will eventually be called the People's Communes in the late 1950s. But basically, it very much mimics what Joseph Stalin was doing in the Soviet Union in the earlier years, in which Stalin was forcing through the collectivization of farms, forcing people to start hitting quotas and targets for agricultural output. At the same time, Mao Zedong is pushing the Chinese state to industrialize, build factories. The idea is that the vanguard Communist Party needs to basically build industrialization, build an industrialized society. How else can the state eventually fall away and for us to have communism if we don't actually build a proletarian class through industrialization? And this very strange, perverted system of exporting grains in order to get Soviet currency, in order to get Soviet equipment into the country to build this industrialization, is going to start a vicious cycle of exporting the very grain people need to eat and survive. That is part of what is called the Great Leap Forward, which Mao Zedong institutes in 1958. The Great Leap Forward is basically a function of Mao's impatience. Mao wants China to be industrialized yesterday. And so these 5-year plans from the Soviets aren't going that great. He starts to get a little bit impatient, and so he decides to push forward the Great Leap Forward. China's a country of 600 million people. The vast majority of them during the Great Leap Forward, tens of thousands of family units are placed into what are called the People's Communes. These are these places where no private property exists. People sleep in shared areas, they eat in shared areas, they work the land as units. And there is a grand level of dehumanization in this, but it is something that finds its origins earlier in Chinese history. In some of my research, people go back to like 300 BC China to find a foundation of something called the Hukuo, Hukuo. I think it basically, Kuo is like mouth, so it's almost like family mouth, I think, is a literal translation. Somebody who is fluent in Mandarin can correct me there, but basically the Hukuo system is one in which families are registered as households, and they're basically calcified, fossilized to the place, to the area of the country where they currently reside. There's no freedom of movement in communist China, and certainly not during the Great Leap Forward. If your family is assigned to one of these giant people's communes that's going about doing farming of grain and industrializing during this period, you are stuck where you are. And to leave is to invite death upon yourself. That being said, staying put invites death upon yourself as well, because Mao starts, and the entire system is predicated on the idea of passing Great Britain's level of industrialization in 15 years, eventually catching the United States. I think Mao puts a number on it at like 50 years. And so to do that, there is a need for steel, because Great Britain is a great producer of steel. And in order to get the industrialization necessary for steel, the government during the Great Leap Forward does two things. One, they requisition larger and larger and larger quotas of grain from these people's communes in order to export them, in order to get money and equipment to industrialize. And two, they have the people's communes themselves produce pig iron. And this is when we get the famous images and the famous stories of the backyard furnaces during the Great Leap Forward, when peasants in these people's communes were literally melting down whatever metal they had around. Now, you're thinking about rural China, what kind of metal do you even have around? Well, it turns out a lot of the things that were being melted down to meet these stupid quotas were farm tools that people needed in order to farm the grain. You can see how this starts to become a vicious cycle. This is also a very bizarre period where Mao's giving these dictates, like kill all of the sparrows, I think, or crows, which, crows, I don't know if you know, but birds eat insects. So basically, by killing lots of birds, they brought a lot of pestilence, and like the balance of nature was thrown off. People were already destroying their farm tools. People were already having larger and larger amounts of grain requisitioned every year. The quotas were going up, and the force with which the grain was taken was extremely high. And of course, because these were unrealistic quotas, the amount left over for the peasants themselves were disastrously low. Combined with all the other things going on, you get a number that's basically 45 million people die in this period. The population of China starts to decrease 1959, 1960, 1961, 1962. This era, basically no one tries to apologize for. Even the most patriotic even the most proud communists, and even people who ostensibly might profess to be Maoists would not defend this period. The official Communist Party of China refers to the Great Leap Forward. At the time, it's a 4-year period. The Great Leap Forward. The Great Famine kicks in about a year into it. This is called the 3 years of difficulty, euphemistically, in official Communist Party discussions after the Mao period ends. So basically, no one defends this. Even if you are, let's just imagine out there are people who are genuine, Stalinists and Maoists. They still exist today. Maoism is very out of fashion. Stalinism, very out of fashion. Most Marxists today, I think, would subscribe to the views of Leon Trotsky, that is the person ejected in his leadership battle with Joseph Stalin after the fall or the death of Vladimir Lenin. Okay, but let's imagine that you are a Stalinist and a Maoist, and you say state planning is actually fantastic. State planning is what we need in order to build socialism, build industrialization, have the state fall away so we can have communism. Even if you hold that opinion, you probably don't think that the way that Mao Zedong went about doing it was a great idea. The official tally from the Communist Party of China, I believe, is 30 million. Western sources put it at 45 million. For comparison, I think the Holodomor, the famine through collective, that was a product of a similar kind of collectivization from Joseph Stalin in Ukraine, the area that we call Ukraine today. I think it killed maybe 4 million. That's the average of estimates. Of course, when you start to get to these disastrous numbers, you don't know for sure. Could have been 10 million, 20 million. But let's say the official number 4, Mao killed 10 times more millions of people through his Great Leap Forward. It's an absolute disaster. What does Mao decide to do? In 1960, he says, I'm going to take a step back. I'm going to go work on some writing. I'm going to take a break. Well, how very convenient while the population of your country is shrinking due to this difficulty. Mao basically leaves other cadres behind, people like Deng Xiaoping, who's going to become very relevant soon, to Zhou Enlai to clean up the mess of the Great Leap Forward. To his dying day, Mao Zedong will never disavow the Great Leap Forward, even though it is a universally nearly universally considered, greatest man-made famine in human history. Now, I should identify this period when Mao steps away and put it in a little bit of context, because Mao steps away in 1960, these reforms start to kick in, and even though the Great Leap Forward doesn't technically end until 1962, basically the policies are starting to be reversed as early as 1960, because the disaster is so very obvious. Grain outputs are decreasing, industrialization, steel output is decreasing despite all of this pressure to make the numbers go up. And so there is a period of relaxation. Now, it's not to say people were relaxing in this period of time. Obviously, they weren't. It's to say there was less pressure to enforce the rules, enforce the mandates of the Communist Party of China in this period. And this is often described as Shu, first tone, Shu Feng, fourth tone falling, Shu Feng. I learned the pronunciation. I can't remember what the literal translation is, but I think it's strict, less strict, right? It's a period of strictness and then retrenchment, or advancement and then retreat. So in the early years of Mao Zedong, there was attack on the intelligentsia, on experts, on professors. There were expropriation of landlords. There were hundreds of thousands of people persecuted and killed in this period in the cities. There was maybe upwards of 1 to 2 million people killed out in the countryside for being landlords and counter-revolutionaries. Then there's this little break, right? 1950, 1953, there's like a bit of a relaxation before the collectivization kicks in 1956, right? In terms of thinking, there is a period of thought reform right after the communists take power. But then there's something called the 100 Flowers campaign, in which everyone in the mid-1950s is told, we'd love to get your feedback, right? And if anybody has ever gotten a survey from HR that said, we'd love to get your feedback, that is a dangerous game to play, because if the people at the top don't like the feedback, even if it's considered anonymous, well, it might get back to you. A very dark version of that came in Communist China through the 100 Flowers campaign. There was something called the anti-rightist campaign from 57 to 59, in which Mao Zedong basically decided that all the criticism that was coming the party's way was counter-revolutionary. And so all these people that had been invited to give their feedback were then persecuted, forced to give self-criticisms, humiliated in these giant public demonstrations. This bottom-up violence that we saw during the rectification movement is then brought into the anti-rightist campaign. After the Great Leap Forward, there is another lull, right? Like 1960 to 1964-5. There's a period where the Great Leap Forward is wound down, where people who are not named Mao Zedong are basically allowed to make some policy, do some reforms. Mao's not retired. He's always lingering off in the background with his womanizing and writing and all sorts of crazy things. You ever read into Mao Zedong's private life? It's very fascinating. In fact, the thing that he ultimately succumbed to is syphilis. They had a lot of health complications, but Western historians, perhaps being a little mean, said, the syphilis got to his brain, that's how he died. Will, what the hell are you talking about? Well, this period of retrenchment, of thawing, of strict, of loosening, this is going to play out in the decades to come. I said earlier that Mao Zedong is this leader that kind of sets the model for other Chinese paramount leaders. And so I just want to hit home this Shu Feng idea of tightening and then loosening through the early years of Mao Zedong, so that you can recognize it when we discuss it later with Deng Xiaoping, with Jiang Zemin, Jintao, and then ultimately Xi Jinping. Mao sees the people reforming and stepping back from the Great Leap Forward, and he gets a little annoyed. He thinks that the revolution is one that should be permanent. And even though Mao is modeled off of Joseph Stalin, this is one place where he is more in alignment with Leon Trotsky in that he thinks that revolution should just roll on and roll on and roll on. And so he gets a little frustrated with the people that are taking back the Great Leap Forward. And he sees the permanent revolution slipping away. And explicitly, he sees all of this as a threat to the revolutionary, the quote, revolutionary continuity. And this is when we get into the period called the Cultural Revolution. Cultural Revolution. Now, its most intense periods are 1966 to 68. 1966, however, it technically continues until Mao's death in 1976, the Cultural Revolution. And anybody who knows even just the smallest little bit about the Cultural Revolution will know that one of its most iconic and terrifying symbols is the Little Red Book. Now, this is not Mao's Little Red Book. This is something that was published in the presidency of Lyndon Baines Johnson. It's basically a Republican propaganda piece called The Quotations from Chairman LBJ. I think it's absolutely hilarious. It's got little quotations from LBJ as though he is a communist. Spoiler alert, LBJ was not a communist. But if you're, a conservative Republican in this area, you might have thought he was. You might have thought that's a useful way to attack him. Anyway, I just love the props. So I have my little red book here. In 1964, Mao had a little book of quotations from Chairman Mao distributed to what would eventually become the Red Guard. And inside the little book is all of these aphorisms and quotes on socialism, and Mao Zedong thought that all of the Red Guard were expected to know. The Red Guard are, once again, the bottom of society, the revolutionary vanguard. It fits into this Mao Zedong thought, this theory that we addressed all the way back in the rectification campaign, where Mao Zedong wants the bottom of society to attack those above. And so when Mao gets jealous after the Great Leap Forward, when he sees that what thinks he's built in China is falling away, he begins a campaign of mass terror. He tells students, he tells peasants, he tells people in the lower ranks of the party, go out and perpetrate violence on your oppressors, on the revisionists, on the rightists. So students attack their professors. They drag them out of the classroom, out into the public square. They lower party apparatchiks start to condemn and denounce those above them. Families are forced to condemn each other. Spouses condemn one another and denounce one another. It is one of the most bizarre points in history, a mass hysteria, a mass terror perpetrated from the bottom up at the behest of Chairman Mao. The idea, of course, is to repurify and bring back the revolutionary zeal. Things get really, really out of control. The official numbers we get later are that hundreds of thousands of people were persecuted, tens of thousands died in the Cultural Revolution. We'll explain why the party would even publish such things in a second. But outside of China, it's understood that probably more like another 1 million people died during the Cultural Revolution. A second thing went on is that a mass purge of the party took place during the Cultural Revolution. So investigations were launched on all party members, especially those at the upper echelon. Again, some of the most people most allied with Chairman Mao were condemned, were forced to give self-criticisms in public. A lot of people committed suicide in this period of time because of the pressure. People were publicly executed. Absolute insanity. One of the people that was purged in this period was a guy named Deng Xiaoping, and we're going to talk about him again in a second. Another person that was purged was the father of Xi Jinping, Xi Chongchun. I'm sorry for butchering the name, but there's actually a biography that just came out. I'm going to hold it up to the camera on the father of Xi Jinping that let me open my Kindle app real quick. See how far along I am. 6%. So I am not particularly far along in this book. But in any event, Xi Jinping is alive in this period during the Cultural Revolution. The future paramount leader of China is alive, sees his father denounced, is himself sent out in the countryside at some point to learn the benefits of proletarian work. Suffice it to say that the following generation, or three, of Chinese leaders are all going to look back at the Cultural Revolution. It is a permanent scar on China. On the leaders of China. It is a psychological scar that everyone's going to deal with. The one-child policy is another scar, but we're going to come back to that in a little bit. The idea, though, is that this was just an absolutely crazy period of time. Now, the Red Guards, these young students that are waving the little red book and, persecuting everyone, executing vigilantism all over the country and all the cities, well, it just starts to get a little crazy. And the cult of personality around Chairman Mao is never bigger than it is in this moment. And it's in this moment that the cult of personality around Chairman Mao perhaps eclipses even that of Joseph Stalin. The vitriol, the extremism, the just absolute chaos in society is at a fever pitch. You think of Stalin's purges, you think of, mass fear. But we're thinking of like Beria, right? Joseph Stalin's butcher, who persecuted people, and lots of people were persecuted politically without much justification. If you ever read the book, The Court of the Red Tsar, you see a lot of letters back and forth where Stalin and his, investigators are just persecuting people just to keep everyone scared, right? And that's why when, Stalin goes up in front of the Communist Party at the end of his purge, there's like an extremely long standing ovation, 11 minutes long, they say, because who wants to be the first to sit down and be dragged out? Anyway, in China, it's all done from the bottom up. And at some point, this cult of personality hits such a fever pitch, and the vigilantism and the violence hit such a chaotic level that there's a sense that society itself is falling apart and that things have gone too far. And so the students, the Red Guards in 1968 are actually sent out of the cities en masse into the rural countryside. And ostensibly it's because they need to go, like Xi Jinping, this princeling, they need to go out and learn the value of being a, rural farmer and the value of work. But the real reason is because the chaos was just too insane to continue. I forgot to mention, Xi Jinping told people to, in the Cultural Revolution, forget the four olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, old ideas. Now, this is highly specific from Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong thinks that all of Chinese history prior to the communist takeover is bad, for lack of a better term. So the grand father of Chinese governance style, Confucius, bad. Right? Obviously, the nationalists, they fought in the Civil War, bad. The Qing dynasties, the Ming dynasty, bad. The Qin ancient dynasty, like everybody, terrible. Right? The only thing that matters is the new society that's being built. And so you have this, there's like this desire that Mao has. He says that, the buildings that he sees out in Beijing, he sees these old temples. He sees these old symbols of the power of ancient China, of the heavenly dynasty of the Qing, and he says, let's replace that with a factory. Let's tear all this down. Chinese history to Mao was a POC. And the reason I bring that up is because as we go through Chinese leaders, we're going to see that not all of them share that opinion. And the leader, the most like Chairman Mao, among those future leaders of China, he doesn't agree with Mao Zedong on this particular way. But I want to highlight it because, first of all, it's an example of great extremism from Mao. But second, it's relevant when we look at the other leaders of China and how they see Chinese history. I told you that we'd be focusing a little bit extra on Chairman Mao because he is the founder of modern China. That is ultimately his legacy. But we could talk about just one last little bit of his legacy, which is that he made China into the nuclear power that it is. He made it a rival to the Soviet Union. In fact, in the years of Nikita Khrushchev, after Joseph Stalin, Mao took a particular disliking to the Soviet Union. They came to heads. They started to see each other as rivals and enemies. As you recall, that seed was planted when Joseph Stalin slighted Mao on his visit to Moscow in 1949. And actually what takes place is that in some of Mao Zedong's latter years, he begins the process of normalizing relations with the United States. Or I think actually Zhou Enlai, one of his top allies, did whatever. Mao Zedong met Richard Nixon and he met Henry Kissinger and started to normalize and triangulate with the United States against what at the time they both considered to be the bigger enemy, the Soviet Union. Another thing that we can consider a legacy of Chairman Mao Zedong is the existence of North Korea. Now, I personally have seen different perspectives. I've read books when I've been reading about Korean history that said that Mao Zedong really pushed Kim Il-sung to launch the Korean Revolution, start the Korean War, pushed Joseph Stalin to support Kim Il-sung in founding the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, etc. And of course, the story goes that in the early 1950s, when the North Koreans were on the back foot and losing that war to the South Koreans and the Americans, that Mao Zedong flooded the zone effectively with the PLA, with the People's Liberation Army, in order to push back the Americans and the South Koreans and force the stalemate with which we deal to this day, the split of North and South Korea. Now, though the history books say that the Chinese PLA performed admirably, this was another example of when China realized that their military wasn't quite ready to fight a war in any serious capacity without just, flooding numbers across the border. We'll come back to that because that is also a theme of Mao's successors. So next, I want to talk about I don't know if you've ever heard the term ash heap of history. It's a term that supposedly Leon Trotsky said to the Mensheviks that left the evening after the Bolsheviks took power in Petrograd. The Mensheviks basically said, this was not the time for revolution. This is wrong. Like, we have to not do this. And they started to leave. And there's this legend or this counter history, this alternative history of asking, what if the Mensheviks had stayed and opposed the Bolshevik takeover? Because the provisional government in the provisional government in Petrograd was a revolutionary provisional government, at least at first, right? It ended up getting taken over by liberals. We could talk about some of the ins and outs of Soviet politics in this period, but the February Revolution in 1917 is a revolution that topples the Tsar. And what would have happened if the mainstream Marxist opinion had prevailed that night in Petrograd in October 1917 to say, hey, actually, it's not supposed to go this way according to Marxist theory. According to Marxist theory, a country should industrialize, we should have a working class that then gains consciousness and performs a revolution. Russia, being a quote-unquote backwards country, doesn't have that. We, the Mensheviks, think that we should actually allow for that scientific development, that scientific materialist development to occur inside of Russia before we take power, before we encourage to take power. Of course, the Bolsheviks' big argument was, no, we are the vanguard party. We're going to go ahead and take power now. And when the Mensheviks depart from this meeting of the Soviets, of the All-Soviet Congress, after the Bolsheviks have taken power, they basically cede the argument to the Bolsheviks. And Leon Trotsky famously says, and this is verified by John something in a book called 10 Days That Shook the World. He says to the Mensheviks departing, go and you'll be on the ash heap of history. Wow, I just butchered a very famous quote. Wonderful. Why am I talking about this? Because the next person we're talking about is Hua Guofeng. I think it's second tone, so rising. Mao Zedong chooses Hua Guofeng to be his chosen successor. Now, Hua Guofeng is not the first choice of Mao Zedong. He's not the second choice. He's not even, if I'm remembering correctly, the third choice. He is the fourth choice successor of Mao Zedong. And actually, Mao Zedong places him in the premiership as the general secretary in 1976, like just before he kicks the can. And one of the things that makes Hua Guofeng difficult is that he doesn't get purged in the Cultural Revolution. He doesn't actually have that much experience. And he doesn't have much of a power base. And so therefore he becomes a footnote, a little thing to throw in the ash heap of history. That's why I gave you that very, very long anecdote. Mao Zedong in the 70s, as he's approaching his death, as the syphilis is coming for him, is realizing that he has a dilemma. And I think I saw Jude Blanchett on his podcast, or I listened to him on his podcast, Peckingology, a couple of years ago, use the phrase emperor's dilemma. And he's actually, Jude Blanchett moved on to Rand since then. I don't know if that was a phrase he coined, but the idea is that for any authoritarian, anyone who's a dictator, a great power, Alexander the Great, the Genghis Khan, Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, as you come to the end of your life, you're faced with a dilemma. Do you plan for your succession properly, or do you let your country descend into chaos after you die in a succession crisis? The issue for the emperor in this dilemma, as in dilemma, two options, right? Option one, you pick a successor and you say, this is my successor. And the issue, of course, is that then power starts to move toward that successor a little early. Maybe you yourself will eventually be purged. The other option in this dilemma is to do nothing and let your country go into succession crisis after you die. So that's what happened. Oh, my kitty cat wants to participate in the conversation. What, girl? Yeah? Okay, so we now have that perspective as well. This is what Stalin does, and this is what Mao does. Mao tries to basically shoehorn in a successor at the last minute. Hua Guofeng, or sorry, not Hua Guofeng. What's going on with me? Hua Guofeng is this fourth choice guy. He is basically in charge as the paramount leader in China, if we're being gracious, from 1976 to 1981. But really, it's 1978. We'll talk about in a second why that's the case. Hua Guofeng is basically the product of a blip in time in which it's unclear which of the factions that exist within the Communist Party of China are going to prevail. There are the reformers like Deng Xiaoping and his clique, his faction, which helped to institute some reforms after the Great Leap Forward, were then purged during the Cultural Revolution, were then brought back to try to help with the chaos, and then kicked out again around the time that Zhou Enlai dies. So Deng Xiaoping is purged like twice or three times in his life. We'll talk about Deng in a minute, but you have another faction, the Gang of Four. The Gang of Four is led by Chang. I pronounced it wrong, don't laugh. They laugh at us for not being able to pronounce their names. You don't get to laugh at their names for being different. This is the wife of Mao Zedong, Chang, I think. Chang, whatever. She's a little bit of a nut job. I mean, rightfully, she has some things to be a little bit crazy about. Mao is a famous womanizer. He's not faithful to her at all. She runs something called the Gang of Four, she being one of the four, and the other three being the rest of the Gang of Four. They are basically angling to take power after Mao Zedong dies. And they are the reason that Deng Xiaoping is purged for a second time after the death of Zhou Enlai. They make up a second clique. Hua Guofeng is effectively a third clique. He pronounces a policy after he's installed as general secretary called the two whatevers. We're going to be getting into a lot of numbered lists in Chinese politics. There are a lot. The two whatevers, the three represents, I think Mao had the 5 antis and the 8 antis. There's an infatuation in Chinese political communication with putting a number next to nouns and proclaiming policy in that way. The two whatevers of Hua Guofeng were as follows. Let me address my notes so I can quote him precisely. The two whatevers, quote, "We will resolutely uphold whatever policy decisions Chairman Mao made. And 2, we will unswervingly follow whatever instructions Chairman Mao gave. So you can see that what Hua Guofeng is trying to do is to continue the legacy of Mao Zedong. The Gang of Four say that actually we are the true inheritors of the Mao project. And then there's this third, the reformers, Deng Xiaoping, they're going to say, no, we are the true inheritors of the project of Chinese communism, but not maybe Maoism specifically, as we're going to see here in a second. But basically what Hua Guofeng is doing is saying there is no difference between me and Mao Zedong. And in fact, he starts to publish his own visions of like another great leap forward. He starts to publish these paintings of him with Chairman Mao. He starts to propagate this quote that Mao Zedong said supposedly to Hua Guofeng, that with you in charge, I can rest at peace, or I can rest easily. So Hua Guofeng moves very quickly to try to build up a cult of personality around himself that would emulate that of the great helmsman Mao Zedong. There's only one problem with this, and that is that as Mao Zedong dies, there is a palpable release in China. There has been decades now of, think about this. The Qing dynasty collapses. We have the warlord period. We have the nationalist period. We have the Civil War. We have the Japanese invasion. We have the second round of the Civil War. We have the anti-rightist campaign, the 100 Flowers campaign, the Great Leap Forward. We have the Cultural Revolution. Tens and tens of millions of people have died. There are these periods where everything's strict and then loosen up, and then people are asked to criticize, and they're punished for having said the thing that they were asked to say. China is in terrible shape when Mao Zedong dies. Now, part of his legacy is there is a raising of life expectancy generally in China. There is literacy rates that are up higher. There is a form of women's liberation, that is to say that Mao Zedong thought women could work just as much as men. So if you need to meet quotas in the Great Leap Forward, well, men and women should just die and starve and work to the bone equally. Interesting form of feminism. He did not live out any form of feminism in his private life. In any event, people are exhausted. They're just so tired. If nothing else, China needs a reprieve. And so this guy, Hua Guofeng, comes in and says, you know what? It's time for me to have my own cult of personality. It's time for me to build up my own great leap forward. It's time for me to basically continue with the two whatevers. It's not apathy, but whatever Chairman Mao said and whatever instructions Chairman Mao gave, that's what we're going to do. Well, that didn't sit well within the Communist Party of China, neither with the reformists like Deng Xiaoping, who obviously would oppose this because they want to reform, but even with people like the Gang of Four, Chang, who wanted to continue on their version of Mao's legacy. Obviously, they're going to oppose him as well, because Hua Guofeng, they're going to oppose him as well, because they're going to say, well, my version of Maoism is better. So Hua Guofeng is isolated fairly quickly. And there's this other thing that's going to be taking place at this time that Hua Guofeng says, and I'm going to be quoting Ezra Vogel's biography of Deng Xiaoping right now. Hua Guofeng said, quote, "We should learn lessons from Khrushchev." And this is the last point I'm going to make on Hua Guofeng. Nikita Khrushchev, of course, is the Soviet leader who takes over after Joseph Stalin. And Nikita Khrushchev gives a secret speech in 1956 in which he condemns the excesses of Stalinism and Stalin's purge, condemns the cult of personality, and the one-man rule that took place in the Soviet Union. China is going to be going through in this period their own version of this. They're going to have to decide whether their next leader is a Nikita Khrushchev who's going to condemn the cult of personality of Mao, and thereby, in their estimation, weaken the Chinese Communist Party. That's what's perceived to have happened with Nikita Khrushchev, is that by condemning Joseph Stalin, he eroded the authority of the party and brought in the rot. That would eventually lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Obviously, they're not predicting the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 70s, but this is how things are going to be reinterpreted backwards. Even at the time, though, at the time of Chairman Mao's death, there is this fear that if they are too harsh on Chairman Mao and his tens of millions of deaths, that they will undermine the authority of the entire party. And if there's one thing that unites every single leader of China, from Mao Zedong, Hua Guofeng, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Jintao, Xi Jinping, it is that the party must be at the very tippy top, must be paramount. To lose the party, the only purpose to have any liberalization at all is just to give people enough freedom to not overthrow the party. So therefore, this is a very pivotal moment in Chinese history. Now we have to talk about our next guy, Deng Xiaoping. I'm going to make a cut, clean the board, and wipe the sweat off my forehead. So the next person we're going to be talking about is Deng Xiaoping. He is the second true paramount leader of China, but if we're including Hua Guofeng, he's the third leader after Mao Zedong and Hua Guofeng. He leads, roughly speaking, 1978 to 1989. But as we're going to see, he never actually takes that official general secretary title, so it's hard to say when exactly he becomes paramount leader. It's open to some interpretation, which we'll do together. And it's also not totally clear that he departs the role of paramount leader, because that's not like an office title. It's not perfectly clear that he leaves in 1989. In fact, he's going to have an influence into the 1990s. However, roughly speaking, he starts to decisively sideline Hua Guofeng in 1978. In fact, he's really sidelining him earlier than that. It's part of the reason why after he gives a eulogy of Chiu in 1976, just before the death of Chairman Mao, he's purged again, only to be brought back in because all of the party's infrastructure says, hello, like, Deng Xiaoping is a reformer. We need him. China is falling apart. So now we can talk about how Deng got that reputation, because he was on the Long March, and he retreated in that first phase of the Chinese Civil War with Mao Zedong. He was a veteran of the war against Japanese aggression, and he joins the Politburo. He's promoted through this Communist Party apparatus into the Politburo in 1955. So Deng Xiaoping is still a first-generation Chinese leader. He's there from the start of the revolution, and really he exists for, I would say, beyond Mao, the most consequential period of Chinese history, hands down. And beyond Mao, he is the most influential leader of China. So we're going to spend a little time with him. So let me just refer to my notes. If you want a really good perspective of Deng Xiaoping, I can recommend Ezra Fogel's biography of him. I can also recommend a book called China After Mao by a historian named Dikötter, Diko with an umlaut,Tter. The China bots in the comments don't like that I recommended that author, but forget that. He was born in Sichuan to a landowner, and he even had the chance to study abroad. So he is not quite as humble in terms of origins as Mao Zedong, but he is born to relatively modest means and participates in the revolution, joins the Communist Party, and is in the Politburo, as I said, 1955. Now, Deng Xiaoping is the vice chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, of the Politburo, and he is sidelining Hua Guofeng starting in 1978. That begins to happen decisively, as I said. There is a meeting of the plenum of the Communist Party, and there is an atmosphere of change in 1978. Deng encourages people to start to speak their mind. This is within the confines of the party about what it might look like to what will eventually be called reform and open up China. So the question is, what will be different now that Mao Zedong is gone? Now, at this time, the paramount leader is ostensibly Hua Guofeng, and he's saying, I want to be the next Mao. But Deng Xiaoping has a lot of influence. He's got a lot more political background. As I said, he's been in it since the 30s. And he basically has a lot more party cadres at this plenum that think like him than does Hua Guofeng, this relative upstart, inexperienced politician. And over the course of this meeting, it becomes incredibly clear that the way forward is through Deng Xiaoping and not Hua Guofeng. A lot, like if you read Ezra Vogel's biography of Deng Xiaoping, he asserts that this is kind of the moment. And the reason he has to assert this is the moment and not say this is definitively the moment is because Deng Xiaoping does not take the title of General Secretary of the Communist Party at this moment. In fact, he remains vice chairman for quite a bit of time. And it is not really until 1981 when Hua Guofeng cedes the title of chairman of the Central Military Committee, CMC, that we can say that he's truly gone from the paramount leadership. And Deng Xiaoping is, and he and his allies are, the ascendant and ascended faction in the Chinese Communist Party. Now, what you'll hear about Deng Xiaoping in a single line, and it's true, is that he is most known for reform and, secondly, opening up. Now, if you remember nothing else about Deng Xiaoping, that's great mnemonic to remember, reform and opening up. If you don't know anything else about Deng Xiaoping, great. However, reform and opening up, a general liberalization, does not mean that Deng Xiaoping was a liberal. Now, next to the cult of personality of Mao Zedong, next to Mao Zedong, everybody looks like a liberal. Maybe only Joseph Stalin or, I don't know, Kim Il-sung look less liberal than Mao Zedong. Deng Xiaoping is a liberal economically, but not politically. And therefore, he should not be considered a liberal, but nonetheless a liberalizer in the realm of economics. So the first phase of reform and opening up is the rehabilitation of people who have been purged in the Cultural Revolution. There are a lot of people with a lot of grievances that say, hey, I was purged unjustly and I want my reputation back. And of course, Deng being among those people who was purged in this fanfare and this orgy of violence is amenable to that position. He gives a speech in March 1978 about the four modernizations. Now we already had the two whatevers. Now we have the four modernizations. The four modernizations are in terms of agriculture, industry, science, and tech. Now, what the hell does that mean? Okay. Basically, what Deng Xiaoping is advocating, first of all, is that party cadres leave China and go see what life is like in other parts of the world, and to bring back ideas from, yes, even capitalist countries, and to approach them with a level of problem solving, to seek truth from facts, he says, quote. It's also, I see phrased sometimes as, quote, practice is the sole criteria for judging truth. So seek truth from facts, and practice is the sole criteria for judging truth. Now, this sounds pretty darn basic, and comparative public policy doesn't sound that extreme unless, of course, you're a Maoist and you are an autark and you say we need to be completely self-sustaining, maybe a little help from the Soviets, but they're also a-holes. We're just going to live here in our little autarky China and be self-sufficient. Deng Xiaoping says, no, get out there, man. Go look at how ridiculously behind China is. And so he does something that's even more extreme. You'll recall that Mao's quite anti-intellectual, and most professors and intelligentsia, thinkers, writers, artists in the Mao period are considered counter-revolutionaries, and they're some of the first to get purged every time Mao's ego is pricked by this or the other. Deng Xiaoping says, no more of that. Everybody who is experimenting out there, everyone who's trying different things in your factory, in leadership of the Communist Party, if you get an education at a university, he brings back the competitive examinations in China, and he says anybody with expertise is not an enemy, it's not a counter-revolutionary. In fact, we desperately need you because China needs to reform right now. China needs to grow. We need a new era. To get all these famous quotes from Deng Xiaoping, we write a couple of them down real quick. We have the duck quote. We have the cat quote. We have the river quote. What the heck is all that? Cat, duck, river. The duck. there's all these aphorisms and like truthisms that Deng Xiaoping has. The duck one is that, it's making fun of the idea that, somebody who's like a moderately well-off middle peasant is a bourgeois. In the Mao era, right, like owning a little bit of land might have gotten you cast as a middle peasant, and then you might have been literally killed, right, during the expropriation of land. So Deng has this quote that's like, if a villager has 2 ducks, he's a socialist. If he has 3 ducks, he's a capitalist. Funny. Very funny. I can hear you laughing through the screen. The cat quote. This one's a little more relevant to what we're talking about with opening up. When faced with the dilemma of bringing in market forces into China, Deng Xiaoping makes this famous saying. He says, who cares if the cat is black or if the cat is white? All that matters is that the cat catches mice. He's saying, I don't care if you're capitalist or socialist or whatever. All that matters is that it works. And finally, we have the quote about the river. This is where Deng Xiaoping, we talked about Mao for so long that now I just don't believe we can talk about anyone else. The river quote from Deng Xiaoping is that you feel the stones in order to cross the river. So you go across the river carefully by feeling the stones. This is basically his way of describing his economic policy of opening up, of bringing some market forces into the People's Republic of China in order to recover from the economic malaise, the destitution that China was left in after the Mao years. And one of the ways he goes about doing this is by creating special economic zones. And this becomes a policy that continues into this day. But specifically in coastal areas, most famously Guangdong and Shenzhen, the Communist Party starts to encourage in very specific locales market policies, foreign investments, joint ventures. It's where the export economy starts to, you think about China, you think about exporting lots of goods. Goods are exported out of these special economic zones. And the idea here, the metaphor that Deng Xiaoping was using with the river is to say, we are going to open up to some market forces and we're going to feel our way through the river. We're going to feel the stones as we go. We're going to try things out. We're going to experiment. We're going to open up and try some new things economically. Now, what Deng Xiaoping was never in favor of was liberalizing the politics. So liberalizing the economy, bringing in some market forces, bringing in some what will eventually be called socialism, capitalism, market socialism. I mean, it gets a little crazy, but you get the idea. But what he's not in favor of is political liberalization. So there are some reforms, some modest reforms within the party. So the 2-term limit, the 2 5-year term limit for people in high offices of the Politburo, this is a Deng Xiaoping innovation, and it's going to stick around until the era of Xi Jinping. The idea that one man shouldn't be forming a cult of personality is something that Deng Xiaoping believes in. So that makes him liberal relative to Mao. He says, quote, building a nation's fate on the reputation of 1 or 2 people is very unhealthy and very dangerous. So you can see that, he's opposed to the cult of personality. So in that term, his politics are more liberal than Mao. But what Deng Xiaoping does not believe in is the rule of law, constitutional democracy that the West has. He doesn't want to liberalize China economically in order to eventually liberalize it politically, to do something that, a lot of Westerners believe is as natural for China to do, become a democracy, as they believe that as strongly as China believes that it's natural for them to eventually evolve into a communist, stateless society. But eventually, these two things are going to start to contradict one another, because there is a issue as the Chinese economy starts to grow, as markets start to open up, as things start to change, as there's a general liberalization. The Chinese people start to advocate for themselves. Now, this first happens in 1978. There's something called the Democracy Wall on this very famous, I believe, a public transport stop with lots of bus stops, this big wall in Beijing where placards used to be posted. And during the Cultural Revolution, of course, it was full of like party slogans and people being denounced. In 1978, people start to post things on there talking about their experiences in the Cultural Revolution, criticizing the party, criticizing the state. Famously, one person advocates for democracy. And Deng Xiaoping actually lets this ride for a little bit. This is the same time he's letting the internal party start to voice some of their frustrations with the Cultural Revolution. This big sigh after the death of Chairman Mao. Deng Xiaoping's for it until he's not. When it starts to threaten the actual party itself, when Western media starts to pick up on this very famous case of this guy who started posting about democracy and Chinese people deserving democracy, well, that's when Deng Xiaoping shows his true political side and says, okay, no more free speech. We're done with that. We're going to liberalize economically. We're going to have special economic zones. We're going to reform and open up. We're going to invite foreign investment. We're going to normalize relations with the United States. Deng Xiaoping famously travels to the United States to meet Jimmy Carter, normalize relations. He wears a cowboy hat in Texas. He's going to present this image of a liberalizing reformers, but that all stops when the monopoly of power of the Communist Party of China is threatened. One last thing, and then we're going to talk about the big moment where the desire for political liberalization in society is going to hit the Communist Party of China's ultimate desire to stay in power. But one more thing on the economy. This is when we first start to see the economic growth of China perform its miracle. So we get economic growth in GDP of 11%, 7%, 5%, 9%. I just Googled it, but I don't know if those are the precise numbers. I think that's from the World Bank. But the idea is that China's economy starts to grow. And, how could it not? Because basically all Deng had to do was just sit back a little bit, just loosen a little bit. And things kind of took care of themselves. There's a pretty big argument to make that, a country of 600 million people at the time the Communist Party of China took power in 1949, there could have, all they needed to do was to not be held down by Mao Zedong and his crazy state planning. And again, we already said, even those who believe in state planning would say that Mao's state planning was a special breed of crazy. Deng Xiaoping started to see immediate results. However, this does not imply that it was pain-free. And so there's a few things going on in the late 1980s that are a concern. The first is that the price controls, there are liberalizers throughout Mao Zedong's government, and there are people who are even more liberal than him economically. And there's also a sense that in order to get China more open, a little shock therapy is necessary. So, for example, prices in China at this time had basically nothing to do with market forces. And so Deng Xiaoping and some of his allies take price controls away. What happens? There's panic. So there's panic buying and there's runaway inflation. This is happening in the late 1980s. The late 1980s, there's panic by resources, there's inflation as these price controls go away. There's also a feeling on university campuses, particularly in Beijing, most famously in Beijing, that democratization needs to happen. So Western liberal ideas start to take hold. Remember, this period of the late 1980s, 1989, we're very quickly approaching the collapse of the Soviet Union. We're approaching the collapse of the Soviet bloc, a low moment for global communism. China, up until 1989 and the events we're about to discuss, China's a part of that. And there's an alternative history where China's communist government also collapsed, maybe even before the fall of the wall in Berlin and the collapse of the Soviet bloc in Europe. Some students in April to June of 1989 start a series of protests in Beijing, and eventually this spreads to, I've seen numbers from 80 to 300 cities in China. Now, 300 cities in China, China's a big country, don't ever forget it. The tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 cities is these small cities, like where was the COVID-19 originated in Wuhan? Wuhan is bigger than a lot of major American cities. China is a big place. And so in April to June of 1989, unrest develops in major cities across the country. Now, Western sources will come to call these pro-democracy protests, and to a certain extent, they certainly were. Most famously in Tiananmen Square. Now remember, Tiananmen Square is where the People's Republic of China is proclaimed. It has a lot of symbolism for that, obviously. Mao Zedong made it like infinitely bigger. I think he quadrupled its size during his time to represent the majesty and the power. This is where all the marches take place for the Communist Party. Just recently, there was the 100th anniversary of the 80th anniversary of the victory over the Japanese war of aggression that was celebrated just this month, September, I believe, 2025. Xi Jinping gave a speech there in Tiananmen Square. I'll put up footage of that. And he wore a Mao costume, that typical gray fatigues or whatever. And so Tiananmen Square, super symbolic. This is where a group of pro-democracy students start to protest. And they even put up a Statue of Liberty within Tiananmen Square. Now, keep in mind that we do not know definitively why people in something like 80 to 300 municipalities throughout China went out to protest. We have some idea we have footage of people advocating for democracy, lots of students, but keep in mind, in a country of a lot of people, there are a lot of reasons. There's also just a general sense that people are unhappy, that maybe their resentments and grievances from the Cultural Revolution all those years ago have never truly been rectified. They've never been allowed to express themselves. There's also the issue of inflation that we referenced. So prices are going up. People are feeling unsettled. There's a sense that the basic social contract in China is being violated by the government. When we get to Xi Jinping, we're going to talk about what that social contract is. But there's a basic exchange. Anyone who's read Hobbes' Leviathan knows that the basic idea of political social contract theory is that the people of a place give up the political power to in Hobbes's formulation, a Leviathan, most commonly a king, right, or an emperor. They say, you have ultimate power, and you get to run society so that our basic needs are met. That I'm butchering social contract theory. This gets adapted in Lockean theory. When you talk about life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, the basic social contract is the government exists just to protect a certain number of things. And of course, when you get to Eastern philosophy and Eastern politics, Marxism, you get positive rights. Like, so the government shall make no law regarding an establishment of religion, or the government shall make no law infringing on free speech, right? Or the government shall not quarter troops in your home, that famous Third Amendment to the U.S. Constitution we never talk about, right? These are shall nots. The government shall not do these things. These are negative rights in that sense, right? It's not about what the government owes you. It's about what the government shall not do regarding your individual rights. It's an individual paradigm. One of the main innovations of Marxism, and of course, then of all of its outcroppings in the East, in Russia and in China, in Cuba and elsewhere, is that it is about positive rights, what the government owes you. And I don't mean that in a negative sense, right? I think that this is my personal politics coming through, but liberal democracy, we have a different social contract after the progressive era in this country. We have things like Social Security and Medicaid. We have basic social safety nets in Western Europe, the NHS in the United Kingdom. In Germany, you have things like, Kindergeld, children's money for, basic sustenance after you have children, right? We have an idea of positive rights in the West that now live in a harmony is not the right word. We're in a pretty difficult period, but they live within our paradigm that primarily, however, recognizes negative rights, the shall nots of what government will not do. 1989 China does not have many shall nots applied to the government. The only true shall not is that the people shall not threaten the monopoly of power of the Communist Party. And this is a true challenge, and probably the challenge of Deng Xiaoping's life, when he is faced with what to do about all of this mass unrest, all of these democracy protesters. And if you're looking for a good account, Jonathan Spence, who I mentioned earlier for his very short but good biography of Mao Zedong, he also has a book, Jonathan Spence does, called The Search for Modern China. And I think his chapter towards the end on the Tiananmen massacre and these unrest moments in China in 1989 is very good. But you could also just Google it, whatever. As long as you're not in China, you can't Google it there. The point being that there are lots of discussions about what to do. Deng is a reformer, remember, economically. Politically, he's a very modest reformer, right? Like intra-party reforms, term limits, not having a cult of personality. But does he want the Communist Party to be subject to liberal democracy, to negative rights, to shall nots, to free speech? No. When push comes to shove, Deng Xiaoping is not a liberal. And so when the conservative members of the Communist Party of China say we need to crack down on this democracy movement, on this unrest, particularly, however, on the democracy protesters, and in this case they are democracy protesters in Tiananmen Square, Deng Xiaoping assents to this. And soldiers are sent, and we have the Tiananmen Square massacre. We have the famous tank man that I'm sure you've seen. And we have something officially between 300 and 3,000 dead. But actually, I was reading, interestingly enough, a secret diplomatic telegram was uncovered by the BBC in 2017 that basically internally the Communist Party of China says that 10,000 people were killed in the crackdown on these protests in 1989. But we could say, probably safely, we could say thousands of people, less than 10,000, but more than the official 300 number that the Communist Party of China gives us. And that's June 4th, 1989. Now, this is a near-death experience. That's a phrasing I see a lot. I couldn't tell you exactly who said it first. It's not an original phrasing from me. You will see people describe this moment, Tiananmen Square, as a near-death experience for the Communist Party of China. I mean, think about it. The Berlin Wall was going to fall in November 11th, 1989. The Soviet Union's going to collapse in 1991. Retrospectively, China's decision to basically shell up and put down these protests saved the Communist Party of China's skin. And we can see now, here we are, 2025 is the time I'm recording this video, that the Communist Party of China has survived all this time. However, in all this time, it has also been going through a reckoning process to try to figure out what went wrong then and try to figure out what went wrong in other places like the Soviet Union when it did collapse, to try to figure out how to prevent the monopoly of power that the Communist Party of China has from going away. A couple more things on Deng Xiaoping that are really important. I would be loath to not mention. People would say, one of my least favorite YouTube comments, you failed to mention. It's like, well, okay, well, this is not a scripted video, so maybe I can cover just about everything. But a lot of my videos are scripted. You forgot to mention it's BS. Sometimes you just have to make a cut, buddy. One-child policy. The one-child policy is based, I'm sure you've heard of it. It was a policy that began in the late 1970s and technically ran, I believe, into the 2010s when it was officially abolished. But it was most intense in the 1980s and 90s. That said that each Chinese family can only have one child. And the idea was based in what is called Malthusian economics, the idea that resources are finite and that, if populations get too big, grow too exponentially, people will starve to death. And effectively, this was an engineering project of the Communist Party of China to prevent the population from getting too out of control. In the Mao era, he encouraged lots of births. He just, the more people who can work on the people's communes and starve and die. And I mean, who cares? I'm Mao Zedong. I don't care about any of this. Deng Xiaoping and people around him who influenced him to advocate for this one-child policy, they believed that, explosive population growth in China was a huge threat and that the survival of the state depended on it. If you want a little bit of a interesting personal accounting of the one-child policy from someone who did not, and I stress this, did not suffer in it, there's a book by Keyu 2023, The New China Playbook. The book itself, you should read criticisms of the book as well if you go and read this book. But he does talk about the experience of someone he grew up in this period as in the cities. And one of the products of the one-child policy is that the children that were born got a lot more attention from their parents. A lot more resources were dedicated to that single child. And most children considered it normal, particularly like so-called middle class or these sort of intelligentsia working thought working people in the cities, that it was pretty standard to have just one child per family. That was the norm. And it's in the rural countryside where, of course, the party is going to focus a lot of its efforts, because this is where people are having lots and lots and lots of children in order to do labor on the farm. This is something that, we see even to this day. People in more poor societies or underdeveloped areas, as the Marxists would call backwards areas, they have lots of children because they need more farm hands, and there's an assumption you're going to maybe lose a child or two along the way. The Communist Party's official number is that 400 million deaths were prevented by the one-child policy. There were also lots of really dark things that happened that I don't need to get into. There were a lot of forced abortions. There were, lots of girls in particular were killed because families wanted boys. And if you're only going to have one child, it should be a boy in that culture. That means that China has more men than women, and that's creating a lopsided demography that will affect them this century quite intensely. There's an expectation that the population of China will actually shrink. So the fear of it running out of control and growing too much was not only unfounded, but now the opposite is happening, that China is going to be losing people, losing healthy working age people over the course of the 21st century. It all originates with the one-child policy. Another thing I wanted to mention with Deng Xiaoping is Hong Kong. So I've made videos on my channel about Hong Kong. Hong Kong was taken during the Opium Wars in the 19th century. So you have the first Opium War, 1840, 1841, 1842. I've run out of space. You have the second Opium War, I believe, in the 1860s. And then you have something called the New Territories leased for 99 years to the British in the late 1890s, if my memory serves correctly. Someone in the comments can correct me if I got that wrong. But basically the island, if you look at a map of Hong Kong, there's the island of Hong Kong. That was taken first. Then some of the areas around Hong Kong were taken second. And then the new territories were leased for 99 years to the British government, starting, I believe, in 1899. So fast forward, 1980s, the Communist Party of China is already thinking about, hey, in a few decades, that lease is going to be up. What's going to take place? And the British are thinking about it too. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, sends a former prime minister named Edward Heath in the late 1970s to kind of feel out Deng Xiaoping, who at this time is serving as the vice chancellor of the Politburo of the CCP. And the idea that the British have is that they want to have something called joint sovereignty over Hong Kong. And they're like, hey, Hong Kong's great, right? And you guys are all about reform and opening up and free markets. You have these special economic zones. And hey, why don't we try something completely new and have joint sovereignty, British and China in Hong Kong? Well, Deng Xiaoping rejects this hardcore. And again, we're seeing here that Deng Xiaoping, in the end, his loyalties are to the party and to the narrative the party has, which I might be able to get into in a little bit. But the point being that Deng Xiaoping says, no shared sovereignty. Skedaddle, Britain. Get the hell out. We're going to have full sovereignty over our unified China. We're going to take Hong Kong back. You are to play no part in it. And in fact, Margaret Thatcher goes in, I believe, September of 1984 to meet Deng Xiaoping personally and again propose some sort of a transition period. There's this sense that the new territories are leased. That is the areas just north on the connected to the actual mainland of China. That lease will go up. There's no way that if those territories lose their sovereignty, that there's no realistic way that Hong Kong under British sovereignty is going to thrive when it's cut off from the rest of what has been developed in the land. And so, Margaret Thatcher's like, can we come to a deal? And again, Deng Xiaoping's like, we can come to the deal where you give us Hong Kong back. And if you don't in the next 2 years, so roughly by 1986, 1987, I'm just going to send the PLA into Hong Kong, so you might want to sign a deal. I made a mistake. That was in 1982 when she had that visit with him. I just realized because in 1984, we get the signing of the Sino-British Treaty. Remember, Sino, S-I-N-O, is the prefix for China. So it's the China, the Sino-British Treaty of 1984 says that after a transition period that Britain is going to cede all of Hong Kong back to China, and that will be done in roughly 1997. Hong Kong will be under what Deng Xiaoping calls one country, two systems. And that's a very important phrase, not just for Hong Kong, but also for Macau, and particularly for us in this era, Taiwan, because it becomes one country, two system, the basis of governance in Hong Kong, and presumably would become the basis of governance in Taiwan if it were to return to control of mainland China. Now, of course, the idea of one country, two systems is that China reunifies, so Hong Kong, or what they would like to have today, Taiwan, is going to come back into and rejoin China, but that in the end, it's going to continue to have its own system. That two systems is going to be one for the rest of China and one for just Hong Kong, right? One for Taiwan, where it's going to have its democracy, perhaps. It's going to have its free market economy. It's a great financial system like Hong Kong has. It's going to continue to exist as this interesting political project. And in fact, the Sino-British Treaty says that that's going to continue until 2049 for like 50 plus years after takeover. At least 50 years, I think is the language. So Deng Xiaoping is part of he stands actually in the background of videos of the signing of the Sino-British Treaty, but his role in making that happen cannot be understated. So how can we condense Deng Xiaoping into a legacy? Well, first, he's the man who comes in after the death of Mao Zedong, and he says we're going to change things, but we're going to change things in a different way to how Nikita Khrushchev changed things after the death of Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. We're not going to condemn Chairman Mao. We're not going to have a secret speech where we say everything Chairman Mao did is bad. We are instead going to say that Chairman Mao must be part of the legacy of China, must be integrated. The great helmsman must be integrated into our history because it is not in our interest to tear the party's authority down in that way. Nonetheless, he is a reformer, and he does bring about his, 4 modernizations. Sorry, I've been going for a couple hours now. 4 modernizations. And these are actually things that are going to be put into China's constitution in 1999. So you're going to start to see this development of China's constitution where the influences are being codified within the written constitution. So first, it's Marxist-Leninist principles. Second, it's Mao Zedong thought. And in 1999, they're going to add Deng Xiaoping thought. That is the idea of reform and opening up China with, adapting China and to market conditions, to the materialist reality of what it is to be China, to pivoting away from like hard industrialization to consumer goods and an export-based economy and foreign investment and growth and Malthusian policies like the one-child policy. That's all going to be baked in here. And the point I'd like to make with all this is that in the end, Deng Xiaoping, for all of his interesting ways of leading, when push came to shove, with the democracy wall in 1978, with the unrest in 1989, his position was party first, democracy no. Okay, so now we're ready to talk about Jiang Zemin, and he's an interesting character, but we're going to be able to move with him a little bit quicker because the two titans that we really had to address were Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. We'll spend a little extra time with Xi Jinping. Jiang Zemin is nonetheless an important leader in the history of China. He is paramount leader from 1989 until about 2002. And again, this little 2002 number is going to be a little bit open to interpretation because Jiang Zemin, despite the fact that he holds to norms fairly well, remember Deng Xiaoping has changed the constitution in 1982 I believe, maybe 1984. I think it's 1982, amends the constitution to limit office holders in high places in China to 2 5-year terms. Well, Jiang Zemin, you can see here, he's going to serve like 13 years. He's going to fudge it a little bit. And in fact, he's going to hold the position of the Central Military Committee until 2004. So he's going to, maintain power nominally for 13 years. Officially for 13 years. And then nominally, he's going to keep a little authority for a couple more years because, power, why would you ever give it up, right? You got power. So Jiang Zemin is an interesting guy. First of all, he is the most... Okay, well, obviously Mao has his cult of personality and stuff, but Jiang Zemin is the most, let's call him the most animated leader that you will find in China's history. So this is a man who really enjoyed speaking in foreign languages and performing. He's born and goes to a school where he's going to learn electrical engineering, and he's going to learn Russian and English. In fact, he's going to learn how to quote the Gettysburg Address. It's like this weird thing he's going to do all the time throughout his life in lots of different moments. He's going to say the Gettysburg Address in English to people. He's also going to become well-versed in Russian literature. And so he's actually able to have pretty darn good relations with Russia, even though it's no longer nominally communist like the Chinese, because he's going to be like, would you like to talk about Dostoevsky, Mr. Yeltsin? And, Yeltsin would knock back a shot of vodka and be like, yes, please, let's talk about this. You can tell after 2 hours I'm getting a little loopy, but I think nonetheless, my point stands. Jiang Zemin makes his way up the party hierarchy. He becomes the mayor of Shanghai, technically the party secretary of Shanghai, in the late 1980s. And on a trip to Sydney, he famously went to the Sydney Opera House and insisted on going up on stage and singing before an empty auditorium. Interesting dude. He is an engineer. And there's a book that just came out this year by an author named Wang called Breakneck, which, his thesis is actually talking about all these engineers that come after Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. And how the idea of engineering society, be it the one-child policy, the surveillance state today, the Great Leap Forward, that the engineering and people who studied engineering are basically the defining characteristic of Chinese leaders. And Jiang Zemin is one of them. Here's a quote: Deng Xiaoping exuded a ebullient personality, but deviated little from Deng Xiaoping. That's from a book called Party of One by Wang, ostensibly a book about Xi Jinping. But in any event, you'll notice that Jiang Zemin becomes party secretary of the Communist Party of China in 1989. Let me get a little more specific with you. Who becomes party secretary of the Chinese Communist Party in June of 1989? Now, we just finished talking about Deng Xiaoping, so you'll know that means that Jiang Zemin was installed into the leadership of the Communist Party of China in the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square massacre and the overall unrest and the protests in 80 to 300 cities throughout China. So why is Jiang Zemin selected? Because Shanghai is a big old city, right? And he's the party secretary there, but why is he chosen specifically to come in June 1989 and just suddenly be thrust into the position of paramount leader of the Chinese Communist Party? Well, the reason is because of how he handles himself in Shanghai when the unrest is happening. He does two things that endear him to Deng Xiaoping. The two things are he behaves like Deng Xiaoping and he behaves like Deng Xiaoping, but let's be a little more specific. He embodies this idea of the opening up reformer without forgetting that the party comes first. So Jiang Zemin doesn't just crack down on the protests in Shanghai. He does it with a bit of flair. He goes and quotes the Gettysburg Address to some of the student protesters, to what the BBC described as their shock. I'm sure it was. So he's he's engaging with the demonstrators. He's showing this flamboyance. He's showing he's not afraid of them. But then he ultimately does crack down, but he does so in a way that doesn't necessarily involve the use of military force. Instead, what he does is he closes a liberal newspaper that was seen as a provocateur of these protests. That newspaper is called the World Economic Herald. So liberal economics, conservative politics, he's the perfect foil for the Tiananmen Square crackdown. Now, there's a challenge for Jiang Zemin when he first comes to power, and that is that he is surrounded by a bunch of ascendant conservatives. There is a quick postmortem after the events of Tiananmen that maybe we as a Communist Party, maybe we've gone a little too loose here with democracy, and maybe what we should do instead is go back to the policies that look a little bit more like Mao, go back to the revolutionary zeal. Perhaps all this reforming and opening up invited all this chaos that we're now having to put down. And Jiang Zemin, when he comes to power, because he's basically imported from Shanghai, he doesn't have his own power base yet. And so there are threats to the reform and opening up that embody the first few years of Jiang Zemin's rule, 89 to 1992. What happens in 1992? Remember, I told you that Deng Xiaoping didn't totally disappear from the scene. He's quite old at this point. In fact, I think Deng Xiaoping was already in his 70s when he took power. But in any event, Deng Xiaoping goes on something called the Southern Tour in 1992. Now, is the Southern Tour like a visit to all the wonderful beaches of China? Is it, Deng Xiaoping's poetry tour where he's going around giving his Deng Xiaoping thought? No, the Southern Tour is Deng Xiaoping going to the places where the special economic zones were instituted in the 1980s, like Shenzhen and Guangdong and all these coastal cities of China, and basically making speeches and going around the Conservative Party apparatus that was trying to restrict reform and opening up. In fact, was trying not to publish things that Deng Xiaoping was saying, even though he was technically still he was never purged or anything. He was still the paramount leader, right? But the People's Daily was not publishing opinions of Deng Xiaoping at this period because there was this retrenchment into conservatism. Well, Deng Xiaoping goes on the Southern Tour in 1992. The West picks it up. It gets laundered through the Hong Kong press, which is totally free at this time in 1992. Remember, the handover is not until 1997. And he basically gives Jiang Zemin his full endorsement. Now, it's not like a personal endorsement for Jiang Zemin, but it's basically a defense of the reform and opening up that has taken place since Mao Zedong's death under the paramount leadership of Deng Xiaoping. It is an exercise in legacy saving, but it is also what brings Jiang Zemin to full ascendancy within the Communist Party of China, and it is ultimately what brings about the years of the largest economic growth that China has ever experienced. I have some numbers here. The economic change, 1992, that very year, 14.3% GDP growth. 13.9% the next year. We had 9% growth, 8% growth. This is when, China becomes the manufacturer of the world. The stereotype made in China being on the bottom of everything. This is the Jiang Zemin era. This is when reforming and opening up starts to really bear its fruits. We're not just getting out of the malaise of the Mao years, of the tragedy of the Mao years. Now China is growing and it's pulling off what would be considered an economic miracle, lifting hundreds and millions of people out of poverty. And when the Communist Party of China goes about justifying its existence, its monopoly on power today, the very first thing it says is we lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. We're a country, 1.4 billion people. We did that, the Communist Party of China. Now, I'm not going to get into the analysis of that right now. It's 100% true. The question is, did we need the Great Leap Forward and giant famines and political repression in order to achieve this, right? Like, there are other countries in Asia that had economic miracles that didn't involve that level of repression. I guess I did just give my opinion, whatever. The point is, it is an interesting motif that we will return to, is the utilitarianism of the Communist Party of China. The ends justify the means, right? We had to do all this. We have to, we had to have the Great Leap Forward because it was part of our learning. It was part of how we got here to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. This is the first time in China's history when private companies contribute more to gross domestic product than so-called state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises were the bulk of the economy, were 100% of the economy in the Mao years. These were obviously state-owned companies, and people who worked in these companies had great benefits and blah blah blah. But they were kind of the stereotype of bureaucracy. They still exist today, and they're actually seeing a resurgence in the current era under Xi Jinping. That's a topic for later. But basically, for the first time in Jiang Zemin's rule, you have private companies making up the majority of GDP in a socialist country. So isn't that interesting? I'm going to rapid fire the rest of Jiang Zemin's time in office. He brought the military to heel. In 1998, he gave them the order to stop profiteering and grifting and to professionalize. In the Deng Xiaoping era, the military had a couple pretty big catastrophes, one of which in Vietnam. There was a sense that the military was not ready to actually fight a war. And the real challenge, of course, is that the monopoly of power that the CCP has is reliant upon the military being their protectors. What if the Chinese Communist Party was faced with something existential like the fall of the Soviet Union, where the military made a half-hearted attempt, some conservative elements within the Soviet Union tried to stage a coup, but like in the end, the party apparatus and the military failed the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and the whole project collapsed. So there was an existential fear that Jiang Zemin felt that the military needed to modernize, they needed to professionalize, and like the reform and opening up era, where there was like lots and lots of corruption within the military, there was basically profiteering going on within the military, it had to stop. Now, I will tell you that did not stop completely. Jiang Zemin was somewhat effective, but corruption in the military is something that's being fought to this day. And we'll talk about some of Xi Jinping's purges of the military a little bit later. Another thing that makes Jiang Zemin unique is his desire to get out of China and go on tours for foreign policy. So he comes to the United States. I think he goes to George Bush's ranch after 9/11. Not like literally right after 9/11, but like 2002, he goes to George Bush's ranch, hangs out in Texas and Crawford with George W. Bush. He's the first world leader to try to give George W. Bush a call on September 11th, 2001. He sees the relationship between the United States and China as extremely important because foreign investment is flooding into China in this period. And so, ironically, this giant capitalist country is the key to the success of the socialist system. And Jiang Zemin knows it. So there's an incident with a spy plane in the Strait of Taiwan, I believe. There's an incident with a mistaken bombing of the Chinese embassy by Americans in Belgrade during a NATO exercise. Jiang Zemin relatively deftly navigates these relatively minor crises for the greater purpose of making the relationship with the United States strong. And he even does, I think he is the only Chinese leader to have done an English language, partially English language interview with an American media outlet, 60 Minutes. If you've already watched this much of my video and you're interested, I would actually recommend going and watching that interview. It's quite funny. It like switches between Chinese and English sometimes. Jiang Zemin's typical style, right? He wants to connect with people. He's like bubbly, energetic, animated. He switches between Mandarin and English all the time. It's just part of who he is, and it's part of this grander charm that he's trying to lay on for U.S. relations. Okay, so I just set down my clipboard because I need to write on the board. 3 represents. You're like, oh boy. More number nouns. 3 represents. Okay. So we had the 4 modernizations from Deng Xiaoping. We had the 5 antis, 8 antis from Mao. We had the 2 whatevers from Hua Guofeng. Now we're going to get the 3 represents. Are you tired of Chinese political communication yet? I have great news for you, though. We only need to really worry about one of the 3 represents. This is Jiang Zemin's basic political philosophy that he's going to express during his time. It's eventually, like the other things, going to be integrated into the Constitution of China. But there's only really the number one represent that we need to worry about. And I've got it here, quote, I'm going to quote it precisely. Represent, so 3 represents, represent the developmental trend of China's advanced productive forces. represent the development trend of China's advanced productive forces. Do you know what that means? Of course you don't. That's why you're watching this video. I know what it means, and it is not nearly as goofy as it sounds. Productive forces. So in Marxist terminology, you seize the means of production, right? The proletariat, the working people seize the means of production. In what? My cat, come here. This is the one that's been interrupting the video so much. I'll put you down. You okay? Okay. I love you. I'm sorry. I'll be done soon. We only have Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping left. And then maybe it'll be time for you to have dinner. So, productive forces are the forces of industry within a country. And in China, remember the point of the Great Leap Forward was to increase the productive forces of the socialist economy so you can eventually get to communism, blah, blah, blah. Now, I'll be real. Like by the time Jiang Zemin's in office, we're not talking about, organizing productive forces so that we can achieve communism, right? That myth or that mythos of like the state disappearing, that's kind of lost. And what we're talking about now, though, is just effectively growing the economy. And that's really what Jiang Zemin is doing. So integrating, representing the new productive forces as they represent, what does that mean? It means explicitly putting the new capitalist class in the Communist Party. So the first represent, it's all that, word salad. What it actually says is we should let people who are getting rich be inside the Communist Party. That's kind of crazy if you think about it, right? This is a Marxist-Leninist party being like, hey, all these capitalists should hop on in, right? That seems wild. And especially for someone like Mao, that would have been unthinkable, right? This is a proletariat peasant party. These are the people we purged in the Cultural Revolution from society, not just the party. Like, what are you doing? Well, Jiang Zemin is of the opinion, better to have the capitalists in the Communist Party than have them without messing with things. And we're going to see this is the era, I believe, or maybe it's probably Hu Jintao. Hu Jintao, this next decade is when you're going to get the startup entrepreneurs like Jack Ma, who founds Alibaba. If you ever gotten something from Alibaba Express, that was his company, his startup. He's like the Elon Musk or the Jeff Bezos of China. And it's about integrating these people who, by force of productive forces, by force of money, being able to do things, are going to eventually wield influence whether the Communist Party wants them to or not, which means we better go ahead and bring them in so that we can at least keep an eye on them, kind of hopefully, have them as allies with us. And these sorts of issues are going to come up in the next decades. But Jiang Zemin is the great innovator of this. His three represents are part of the Constitution of China, and it's actually required now. It's the law in China as of like 2023 or 4, I think. Someone can fact check me in the comments that on the exact date. The law is true. The law in China is that if you are a company of a certain size in China, you must have a Communist Party cell within your company. So, bringing these productive forces into the Communist Party of China is the lasting legacy of Jiang Zemin. Last thing on Jiang Zemin, this is he's like the furthest extension of reform and opening up. So obviously he gets Deng Xiaoping's blessing in 1992 on the Southern Tour. Jiang Zemin is, as far as reform and opening up goes, at least until now. So what we're about to see, we already talked about that period of Shu Feng, right? Retrenchment, opening up, restriction, thawing, freezing, thawing. I'm losing my words, but you get the point. Like we know that these things go in cycles, right? We're about to see, starting with Hu Jintao, a cycle where the reform and opening up is questioned. And part of it is going to go back to the Tiananmen Square incident and this idea that reform and opening up is unleashing forces in society that the Communist Party cannot control. Jiang Zemin tries to address that through the three represents and saying, hey, represent number one means we're bringing capitalists into the Communist Party, and other people are going to handle it in a different way. And that's what we're about to see with Hu Jintao, with whom we will spend the least amount of time, I guess, besides Hua Guofeng. Let me clear the board. I'll be right back. You're doing great. You're doing great. You've been here so long. All right, it's time to talk about Hu Jintao. Hu Jintao. And when I think of Hu Jintao, I think of the George W. Bush era. This is when I was a teenager and kind of coming of age. And, you know, there was this sense that China was kind of non-threatening and not a big deal. The reason is because the focus of the United States in this period, Hu Jintao, is the party secretary, and he's very precise. He is the paramount leader from 2002 to 2012. So Deng Xiaoping, the guy who installs term limits, he sticks around longer than he's supposed to. Jiang Zemin, he fudges the numbers, right? And he's going to stay part of the Central Military Committee. Remember we said Jiang Zemin actually stays at that role until 2004. So he fudges it a little bit. Hu Jintao? Nah, son. He gets in 2002. He gets out 2012. He don't mess about. He didn't want to be there. Let Xi Jinping take over. I want out. Now, is it because everything went absolutely terrible? No, not really. Hu Jintao is, let's just call him a bridge between the reform and opening up period and the Xi Jinping period. You know, maybe we'll get some different analyses over time about things that he did. It's a time of relative prosperity. But think of him like Bill Clinton in that, like Bill Clinton, you know, presided over like an era of growth in the United States, generally speaking. I mean, we had a budget surplus one year because of the work that he and the Republican Congress did. But like Bill Clinton, was he like a transformative leader of the United States? No. Right. And so you wouldn't, like, if you're going to say like our most important presidents, or you presumably wouldn't go with Bill Clinton. By the way, if you're seeing shadows and things casting on me, it's because I've been going so long the sun's setting. I'm losing my natural light. I got a box light here. If the lighting looks terrible over time, I'm very sorry. I'm just trying to give you educational content. I assume if the audio is okay, blowing in your ear, ASMR, baby. Okay, losing my brain here. He's born in 1942. And he is not a transformational leader of China, which is why we're going to talk about him pretty quick. He's also deeply boring as a human. So he also studies engineering. He joins the Communist Party as like part of the Communist Youth League. His early career is all about the party itself. So Jiang Zemin, he's often described as like this guy who liked to engineer, to figure things out, to like see how things worked. And part of the way that his governance was effective once he was in power was that he was a tinkerer of things, an engineer first and foremost. Hu Jintao is what is called an apparatchik first. Apparatchik. It's a Russian word. It basically means bureaucrat in the communist context. So he is, I saw one person called him, quote, a colorless technocrat who joins the Communist Party of China in 1964. And actually, he is kind of making his way into the upper echelons of the party. So he joins 1964. As early as like 1992, 3, I think in my reading, he's already kind of being floated as the successor to Jiang Zemin. So he's actually waiting for his decade in power. And what Jiang Zemin does in this period is he puts all of his Shanghai friends, because remember, Jiang Zemin is basically imported from Shanghai to Beijing to be the general secretary after the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. Come save us, you know, from our own liberalism, blah, blah, blah. Hu Jintao is waiting from 1992 until 2012 to take power. And in this period, Jiang Zemin shoves all these Shanghai people all around Hu Jintao. I think I saw one number that like 62 of 64 Politburo members. I might be butchering that. I better not just say it in BS. But like basically, when Hu Jintao actually takes power in 2012, first of all, the Central Military Commission is still headed by Jiang Zemin. So there's confusion for the first 2 years about like who runs the military. But also all of these, what it's called like the Shanghai gang of Jiang Zemin are surrounding Hu Jintao. Obviously, that makes it hard for him to maneuver because Hu Jintao does not have the identical political opinion that Jiang Zemin has. So we need to talk about, first of all, where they are similar And one of the ways to know that they are similar is to talk about Hu Jintao's last posting before moving into Beijing and being groomed for power, and that is in being in charge of the region of Tibet. Now, if you know Tibetan Buddhism and the Dalai Lama, you know that Tibet is this interesting, dare I say, country that is part of China. And it is a place where there's a lot of separatist sentiment, at least historically. And there was a 30th anniversary of an uprising in 1989, the same year as the Tiananmen Square massacre. There was a 30th anniversary of the 1959 uprising in Tibet, and Hu Jintao was in charge of Tibet at this period. Now, Hu Jintao came down hard on the unrest. He sent, I think, 1,700 armed police officers into Tibet to put down the unrest. He basically took a strong hand and said, I think the description was like, I've seen his quote, firm hand in putting down and quelling any sort of unrest in Tibet. Hu Jintao was showing that, like Deng Xiaoping, like Jiang Zemin, like Mao Zedong, obviously, he is not a liberal reformer politically. He is party first. And remember, we said basically all these people have that same thing in common. They're all party first. However, Hu Jintao is an interesting guy in that he has a vision of the economy that is less liberal, we'll say, than Jiang Zemin. Perhaps we could call it more egalitarian. It is an economic theory that is more interested in consequences for the grand mass than just pursuing GDP growth without any reservation. That's basically what the Jiang Zemin period is, right? 14% GDP growth. Who cares? Grow, grow, grow. Well, that causes issues because the coastal areas where the SEZs are, these special economic zones, they're growing like crazy. The interior, the grand masses of China, they're not really seeing those same benefits. And we are going to have a period at the end of Jiang Zemin's rule of growing wealth inequality and this nouveau riche class in China basically dominating, while these peasant masses out in the stick, they're suffering just like they always were. And all these changes in Berlin and all this Marxist philosophy about represents and opening up and for modernization, like none of that affects the poorest of the poor, who are still living perhaps a little bit better than they were. We're still living on like $100 a year or something. So, Hu Jintao proposes something called the harmonious society. This is his innovation to Marxist theory. The harmonious society. And it is about, I'm sorry, I looked at my notes because there's a very similar thing we're about to talk about called the scientific outlook on development. It gets very esoteric and I have to remind myself what any of this crap even means. Harmonious society, however, it's not crap. It's about finding a balance between growth and what's best for the masses. So Hu Jintao goes out and he says, hey guys, it's great that we're growing and everything, but if only a certain number of us grow on the coast, then we're not going to have a harmonious society. And this is also the resurrection of Confucius. Confucius, that great Chinese thinker. Confucius, oh God, I spelled it, whatever. Confucius, if you recall, Mao was like Confucius bad, right? History bad. And I don't have any quotes in front of me what Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin thought about Confucius, but Hu Jintao is bringing this idea of harmonious society, which kind of dates back to the Confucius philosophy of benevolent leadership, of the state almost being like a father to the citizenry. It's about looking after the great masses. That's the idea behind the harmonious society. So with Jiang Zemin, we were just pursuing GDP growth for GDP growth's sake. With Hu Jintao, we're saying, hey, we can have growth, but if it's not to the benefit of everyone, if it's not to the benefit of the great masses, then we're going to start to violate the social contract, which again, we're going to bring that up. The basic social contract in China, now's as good a time as any to bring it up, is that the Communist Party of China gets to have a monopoly of power. So just like Hobbes' Leviathan has a monopoly of power over the people in that theoretical framework, the Communist Party of China has a monopoly on power in its theoretical social contract with the people of China. What do the people get in return in China? the positive rights we mentioned before. So that means material benefits and rising standards of living. Now, this thought process is going to be instigated by Hu Jintao with the idea of the harmonious society, and then it's going to go onto steroids with Xi Jinping. But we're not done yet. Hu Jintao has something called, hold on, I'm going to make a cut and see if I can fit this on the whiteboard. Hold on one second. It fit. Hu Jintao, the part of Hu Jintao thought that is going to actually make it into the Constitution of the People's Republic of China is the scientific outlook on development, which is related to the harmonious society. So we already mentioned how Hu Jintao thinks that growth is great, but not if we don't have a quote unquote people basis, people as the basis, is some of the phrasing of the scientific outlook on development. That is, material benefits should be spread out a little bit, but he also adds things like environmental protection. So, we can't just grow and pollute the hell out of our country. Like, we should try, like the Americans did in the 70s, to have environmental laws. Even, the Republican Richard Nixon is the one that signed the EPA Act. And I know that today, conservatives are not in favor of any federal government action, but in the 70s, after the radical environmental movement of the 60s, even Republicans were in favor of like, hey, great that we're industrializing, great that we're having a, baby boom and a period of growth after World War II, but, maybe we should just stop dumping lots of pollution everywhere and we're killing ourselves with our own prosperity. This sentiment comes to China in the form of Hu Jintao in the 2002 to 2012 period, that like, okay, we've been growing now for a couple decades. What are the actual consequences? What are the downsides? If you ever go to school for public policy, you'll learn that even the best, public policies have downsides to them. Even like give everyone a puppy, universal puppies, right? And if that's a public policy, that's a law, the Universal Puppy Act, right? Everybody loves puppies. No one's going to be like, oh, I hate puppies. Well, most people aren't, but like, some of your citizens are going to be allergic to dogs. You're going to have big puppy mills, right? And you're going to start to raise dogs in factory farm-like conditions. And really the only way you can get the general public to care about animals and their suffering is if it's a dog or a cat, right? So people would object to that in a way that they don't object to factory farms that bring them chicken and pork and beef. I'm getting off track. The point being that, actually, I don't even know what my point is anymore. I'm going to make a cut. The point was every public policy, no matter how great, has consequences. And in Hu Jintao's position, he's saying, okay, we're growing, but there are consequences to that growth. And part of his scientific outlook on development was addressing that. Now, I should address the word scientific, because I actually did see some authors address the word scientific as though it meant the scientific method. And that's not accurate, I think, because scientific is a Marxist term. Scientific materialism is often the frame used, and it's actually one of the more annoying parts about arguing with Marxists is they'll be like, well, our worldview is a scientific, and you're like, okay, whatever, dude. It's like you can't argue with me because I use science. It's like almost like what I think populists claim elites are like sometimes with their snootiness. Okay, off topic again. It's almost like I've been doing this for almost 3 hours, but we got it. Scientific in this case means looking at the material realities of life in China from a Marxist perspective. So it is not about putting society in a test tube. It's about considering the material conditions that underpin Marxist-Leninist thoughts. And in that way, it is about finding a balance with, here we go, the Constitution of China is getting more complicated. Marxist-Leninist thought, Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping thought, the three represents of Jiang Zemin. And now we're going to add the scientific outlook on development. It's about having the harmonious society infused into our rapid growth. And indeed, for all of the ways that people criticize Hu Jintao from within the Communist Party as the lost decade, as a colorless technocrat, people are going to say that there was political decay and like corruption out of control in Hu Jintao's era, that his last 5 years, his second term, even though he was there for 10 years precisely, that the last 5 years, he might as well have not been there. He was a lame duck. He was wasting his time. Despite all of these things, China continues to experience pretty darn rapid growth in the era of Hu Jintao. You'll also notice this aligns with the 2008 to 2009 financial crisis, the global financial crisis. China was affected too. and China did a stimulus and fared fairly well in the grand scheme. And actually, in the way that the Communist Party of China describes that era, is that the 2008 financial crisis in the West was a reckoning for the West to face its own contradictions of capitalism. That was the moment when, the end of history period that had been described by Fukuyama at the fall of the Soviet Union, when liberal democracy was considered to be on the ascendancy. The 2008-2009 financial crisis is the opposite. That's the moment when the zenith has been passed and Western democracy is on the decline. That being said, China had its own financial system that was intertwined with the West, and it was affected too. And Hu Jintao and the stimulus package helped China to navigate that. Now, one of the interesting things is that financial crisis arguably is going to augment the political philosophy of the last person we're going to talk about, Xi Jinping, who is call him neo-autarchist. Yeah, that sounds like a good word. Neo-autarchist. Autarchist. What does that mean? Well, Mao Zedong was an autarchist, as in he wanted autarky, as in a society that can take care of itself and exist in isolation. Xi Jinping is the language du jour right now is decoupling, strategic decoupling between China and the United States. Xi Jinping is about insulating Chinese societies from the ruptures that it might experience when there's economic turmoil in the West. So we'll get to that in a minute, but some of that logic probably came from the fact that China was affected in the 2008-2009 financial crisis, even though that crisis emanated from the United States, from Lehman Brothers, and nothing to do with China, but it ended up having an effect on China. And that's obviously something that the Communist Party wants to insulate itself from, if at all possible. Now, it would not be me if I did not mention foreign policy, and specifically, even the Chinese Communist Party wouldn't appreciate me calling Hong Kong foreign policy, but I'm going to call it that for the moment. Hong Kong is handed over to China in 1997, so it's some of its first years as part of China. Once again, is in the era of Hu Jintao. The central government in Beijing pushes the government in Hong Kong, the chief executive of Hong Kong, to crack down on what it calls separatism. Article 23 of the Hong Kong Basic Law, that is the basic law, that is the mini constitution for Hong Kong that was supposed to govern it as part of its one country, two systems setup after the handover in 1997. Article 23 of that basic law says that the chief executive of Hong Kong must promulgate and pass laws that protect the mainland government from sedition, secession, and subversion. So, in the Hu Jintao period, Beijing pressures the chief executive of Hong Kong to pass an anti-subversion law. And I don't have the exact year in my notes, but basically, this is one of the first moments of tension in Hong Kong. And we know that in the coming decade, so after 2012, up until about 2022, there's going to be a period of unrest in Hong Kong that is far more consequential. But the first rumblings of that unrest are here in the period of Hu Jintao. Last thing on foreign policy for Hu Jintao that I want to talk about is peaceful rise, quote, peaceful rise. So Hu Jintao promulgates the idea that China's rise should be peaceful. And that's possible. Basically what that means is like China can focus on itself and its own development. It can focus on its scientific outlook on development without the need to be super preoccupied with its military, without the need to say like, oh, tomorrow we have to conduct a war. Because you'll notice in this period, who would become its principal foreign policy rival, the United States, in the next period. At this period, the United States is preoccupied with the Middle East and the war on terror. So China and Asia in general is a bit of an afterthought for the United States. Russia is relatively weak in this period. And so there's like the two old rivals of China are kind of doing their own thing. And Hu Jintao therefore asserts that China can focus on its peaceful rise and not worry so much about militarization. He can focus on this economic development, this harmonious society. He can basically punt the issue of corruption in the military that Jiang Zemin was so focused on to the future. Xi Jinping is going to pick up that ball and he's going to be pretty angry that Hu Jintao did that and not actually focus on it. But the point is that Hu Jintao was like, hey, this is just not my priority at this time. And so actually, one of the interesting developments of the Hu Jintao period is that this is the zenith, that is the top, the apex, the top of the roller coaster, the tippy top, the big part of the bell curve, whatever. This is the best part of history between the Republic of China, Taiwan, and the People's Republic of China, the mainland. So Hu Jintao actually facilitates a meeting between the Kuomintang. Remember the Kuomintang, the KMT, Chiang Kai-shek's party that was evicted from the mainland in 1949? They were set up as the rival government on Taiwan. They've existed there this whole time. There's been Taiwan crises. There's been a constant desire to reunify, right? And in the Hu Jintao era, actually things are quite warm. There's exchanges between the islands, and yeah, the CCP and the KMT actually have meetings. And one of the weird developments of history is that today, the most pro-unification party in Taiwan is actually the Kuomintang, the KMT. Weird, right? I mean, a little bit weird, but because, I mean, in theory, the KMT wanted to unify China all the way back in the Civil War, right? But now that they're in Taiwan, it's like they were the government in waiting to like reinvade China at some point. That never happened. But since then, like Taiwan's been its own little independent place. And you'd think the KMT would be like the old rivals of the communists would not be interested in reunifying with the mainland. But actually, in Taiwanese politics, the KMT is the most friendly China's policy. And part of that goes back to the Hu Jintao era when he facilitated this meeting between the KMT and CCP. So Hu Jintao's legacy is one of continued growth, of trying to balance growth with the great benefits of the people, the material benefits of the people. That's something that Xi Jinping is going to continue. But this is also, from the perspective of the Communist Party of China, a period of corruption, of malaise, a quote-unquote lost decade from a colorless bureaucrat that, you know, compared to like Jiang Zemin before, who was singing songs and quoting the Gettysburg Address, Hu Jintao wouldn't even have like an informal chat with a Western leader in his time in office. So he was a stiff, an apparatchik. And we're done talking about him. Let's talk about our last guy, Xi Jinping. And if you've been with me this whole time, you've kind of started to glaze over the Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. I promise you that Xi Jinping is going to feel a little bit more like Mao and Deng Xiaoping. He is an interesting character and one that we need to go into in a little bit of detail when we try to consider how we can bring all this together. So I'm going to clear the whiteboard. We're going to do Xi Jinping next. The last stop on our journey is Xi Jinping. And as we know, he takes over from Hu Jintao. Hu Jintao, he's in there from 2002 to 2012, precisely 10 years, serves his 2 5-year terms. He's term limited out. He doesn't stick around at all like Jiang Zemin or Deng Xiaoping. He's off for vacation, right? Xi Jinping, a relatively unknown princeling, we'll explain what that means in a second, takes over in 2012. Spoiler alert, Xi Jinping is still in power as of now. I'm making this video, what the hell is it right now? It is September of 2025 when I'm making this video. Xi Jinping is still in office and is showing no signs of getting out of office, which means that he is, at least in terms of length in power, is now flirting with some of the influential period of Deng Xiaoping's life, and should it continue until old age, he will start to flirt with the number of years that Mao Zedong was in power. So Xi Jinping, in terms of time, is a lot more like Mao and Deng than he is Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. However, Xi Jinping is also like Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping in that a lot of people describe him as a bit of a mix of the two in terms of his politics. And the short form of putting that is that he is one who wants the party first and foremost. He's conservative in terms of his Leninism. And again, I'll tell you what that means in a second. But he is still an economic reformer. So one of the first things he does is he visits the places that Deng Xiaoping visited on his southern tour in 1992. Xi Jinping goes back and visits them. So he basically revisits the southern tour. of Deng, and expressing that, balancing opening up with keeping control of the party is his main priority. What differentiates Xi Jinping, however, from Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao is that, and keep in mind, these are relative liberal positions, right? Jiang Zemin is relatively liberal and open. Hu Jintao, a period of relative open and liberal free thought, right? Relative. Xi Jinping goes in the opposite direction. And he's far less liberal than Deng, than Zhang, and Hu. He's far more like Mao in his disposition towards political dissent. He's far more like Mao in terms of centralization of political power around him. He does not seem keen on building a cult of personality and a bottom-up revolutionary spirit in the way Mao Zedong is, but he is not afraid to be one above the equals. In the Politburo, he has centralized the party infrastructure around him. He's obviously manipulated the party to give him a constitutional amendment to allow him to stay for a third term, which he began in 2022. And he is much more interested in having the party get its tendrils in the economy in a way that Deng, Zhang, and Hu never did. And so actually a really famous example of this is the story of Jack Ma. I can't remember exactly what year it was, but Jack Ma, founder of Alibaba, a billionaire Chinese person, he gave a speech in which he was critical of the Chinese Communist Party and advocated for some liberal reforms of the economy. He straight up disappeared for a while. People thought the Communist Party killed him, and I think he's in exile to this day. And I don't think we've heard from him since. Xi Jinping wants those capitalists that were brought in through the three represents of Jiang Zemin to know their place. And it is under Xi Jinping, of course, that we got the famous law that I talked about earlier, where party cells have to be within companies of certain sizes. Once they get to a certain size, they have to have the party as eyes and ears within their operation. No company within China is able to freely express itself or go out on any limbs or operate independently. And I mentioned state-owned enterprises. For the first time, they made more percentage-wise of GDP than, private industry under Jiang Zemin made more of a percentage of GDP than the state-owned enterprises. Xi Jinping is not able to reverse that trend, but he is placing more of an emphasis on these state-owned enterprises, SOEs, in his term. It's almost like a renaissance of making them lean, mean, bureaucratic machines. So he's his own man for sure. I have a quote I want to share with you. Sorry, I think I'm burping into the microphone. It's just been I'm drinking creatine, and I was drinking coffee, but now it's too late. I was drinking creatine now. I'm exercising again, and it's making me burp. I apologize. I'll try to move the mic away next time. Okay. Professor Fengbin, and my mind is blanking on who he is. He's a sinologist, I assume. I'm so sorry, Professor. I knew exactly who you were several hours ago, and now I've forgotten. But he said, he had this famous line that a lot of people have trumpeted and repeated afterwards. Mao made the people stand up. The Chinese people stand up. So Mao made the people stand up. Deng made the Chinese people rich. And Xi made the Chinese people strong. This has also been phrased as China's CCP operating system was upgraded with Xi Jinping. So the first upgrade was Mao, or the first, I guess, software/hardware was Mao, and then the hardware got an upgrade with Deng, a software upgrade, and then Xi gave it its third software upgrade. So the Communist Party of China looked one way through Deng, Zhang, and Hu, and it now looks a new way with Xi Jinping. To quote, to cite my source here, that was Sung and Cheung in The Political Thought of Xi Jinping. I believe that book is from 2021. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Xi Jinping. So his father is actually really high up in the Communist Party of China. He is purged in the Cultural Revolution. And if I'm not mistaken, I'm only 6% into the book after all. The party's interests come first. This biography of Xi Jinping's father, but I'm under the impression that his father was an ally of Deng Xiaoping. That's part of the reason he was purged. But he was also not alone. His family had the whole family is purged in the Cultural Revolution. I think one of Xi Jinping's siblings actually died in the Cultural Revolution. Xi Jinping's mom had to denounce her husband. Xi Jinping, I believe, had to denounce his father, and Xi Jinping is sent into the rural countryside during the Cultural Revolution. Nonetheless, Xi Jinping's politics move back towards that conservatism, that is that hard leftism, that revolutionary zeal, that permanent revolutionary attitude that you would get from someone like Leon Trotsky and Mao Zedong. Weird to compare those two, but this is the attitude that Xi Jinping has, is that a rejuvenation, and that's the key word with Xi Jinping, is that a rejuvenation is necessary. A national rejuvenation. I start writing in cursive when my hand gets tired, so you know that's what's going on. Xi Jinping comes into power in 2012, and nobody really knows what he's going to be like. He's relatively unknown. He's just a princeling. He's held some party positions. His father was a famous member of the Politburo, who was purged and then came back, blah, 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 blah. Xi Jinping, it's like, is he going to be an extension of Deng? Is he going to be like Jintao and be a faceless, boring bureaucrat? Is he going to be Jiang Zemin? Well, Xi Jinping comes out in 2012, and he's not as charismatic as Jiang Zemin. We get that out of the way really quick. But is he going to be a pushover like Hu Jintao? No, he's not. He gives a speech around the time he takes power privately to, remember the word we learned earlier, apparatchiks, so like party bureaucrats in the Communist Party. And he basically describes the existential crisis facing the party that he perceives. He lays it into Hu Jintao implicitly by saying, you know, the party has lost its way, the party is not vanguard enough, and that if things aren't corrected, that the Chinese Communist Party faces the existential collapse that the Soviet Union did in 1991. He labels Mikhail Gorbachev, the glasnost perestroika reformer of the Soviet Union, as a traitor to the Soviet Union, and blames the party for not being steadfast enough in defending him, and the military for not being ready to protect the party from the people. This is the worldview that this is the starting point for Xi Jinping. Everything is terrible. We need a rejuvenation of the party, and we need a national rejuvenation subsequent to pull us out of this crisis. So the very first years of Xi Jinping's rule are defined by his anti-corruption campaign. And I am under the impression that the number of people purged in his corruption campaign rises to over 1 million bureaucrats, both local bureaucrats, small flies, and big tigers, as they're called. That is the big people. I think Lin Bao is the name of one of these huge corrupt, high-ranking officials that are purged in Xi Jinping's corruption campaign. The idea is that the party has basically become worthless, and that part of making it a modern Leninist party is by making it effective. So let's talk about Leninism and vanguard here for a second. The idea behind Lenin's Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, October 1917, is that even if the country has not met the conditions of capitalism needed for a workers' revolution, even if there isn't a big enough proletariat in Russia in 1917, we, the Bolsheviks, the vanguard party, are going to lead them on a revolution anyway. And so in a political science terms, Leninism in a party system means having a vanguard party that leads the way, leads the people, leads the proletariat, right? So what Xi Jinping wants is a Leninist party that is a vanguard party that is ready to lead the people to national rejuvenation. How can it be that way? How can it be a Leninist vanguard party if it is full of malaise and corruption? So the rejuvenation is necessary for Xi Jinping within the party so that a national rejuvenation can be enabled. And the forefront of that is the Leninist system, the Leninist party. Okay, so I had to take a break to write this out. You ready for this one? We had Mao Zedong thought, we had Marxist-Leninism, we had Mao Zedong thought, we had Deng Xiaoping thought, we had the three represents, we had the scientific outlook on development, and now we have Xi Jinping thought. However, the actual title is Xi Jinping Thought on Socialism with Chinese Characteristics for the new era. Forgot the word the. So what is this? Well, it's part of what I just said, that the party needs to be the vanguard again. But the real issue is that Xi Jinping sees the last decades of Chinese history as a flirting with historical nihilism. That is a loss of roots. And so for Xi Jinping, it's about going back to its China going back to its Marxist-Leninist roots, about being a revolutionary party again to lead the people. It is about saying we've had enough liberalization. That's enough. No more. We're going to, get our tentacles in all these parties and all these companies and things. It's also a leaked document. I think it's called document number 9, included prescriptions for the party to consider Western constitutionalism a fleeting ideological fad. So no liberalization, constitutional, democratic Western values. These are ways of the West trying to undermine the authority of the Communist Party. Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era is about, again, we get the Chinese characteristics for socialism. So it's not just Marxist-Leninism, socialism, it's the material conditions in China. And for Xi Jinping, the material conditions, these Chinese characteristics in the new era are, we are on the back foot and we need to defend ourselves. And Xi Jinping thought is so forefront in China right now that there is an app, lo and behold, developed by Alibaba, Jack Ma's company, where every single day 100 million people in China log on to an app that is a play on words of Xi Jinping thought, where they can do quizzes and interact with lectures and answer quiz questions and earn points to prove that they understand Xi Jinping thought. And by the way, the Chinese Communist Party has grown to over 100 million members in the rule of Xi Jinping. So there is this massive emphasis, and it all stems from Xi Jinping thought. And the bottom line is that history is okay again with Xi Jinping. So we remember Mao Zedong thought history was terrible. Xi Jinping will use history for his ends, even if it doesn't really make logical sense. So he is totally willing to use Confucius and continue that resuscitation that Hu Jintao did of Confucius, as long as it serves his principal aims, that the idea that he's like the fatherly figure bringing about the harmonious society, the benevolent leader, right? Xi Jinping is willing to raise up Mao Zedong. Who cares? Like, Mao Zedong was, the Cultural Revolution. It was terrible, but hey, it was about having that revolutionary zeal. And I have the exact phrasing here. Reviving revolutionary heritage is like the most important thing for Xi Jinping. So Mao Zedong, the memory, he's the 4th generation leader of the People's Republic of China. So the memories of all of the bad things of the Great Leap Forward slowly disappearing, the Cultural Revolution fears, and it's all slowly disappearing. And so now he can use that to his political advantage to revive some of those concepts and wipe away some of the bad things, because history can be useful for him in that way. And I had to pull up my notes here because there's a list of things that go into the national rejuvenation that Xi Jinping wants to accomplish by 2050. So there's something that has been called the China Dream. This is Xi Jinping's signature series of goals for China in his rulership, which is now in its 3rd term. One of them was to be a moderately well-off society by 2021. That was the 80th anniversary of the foundation of the Communist Party of China, the 100th anniversary of the foundation of the Communist Party of China. Moderately well-off society, I believe, works out to like an average, I think it was like literally the number was on it, like 10,000 GDP per capita or something. So China has achieved middle income status. That's what the definition of moderately well-off society is. But part of that is also going forward that China cannot be trapped in the middle income trap. That is what happens to a lot of developing countries, is they don't actually make it up into high income status as an economy. Another part of the China dream of Xi Jinping is to unify all of China. So Deng Xiaoping brought in Hong Kong and Macau. Obviously, Jiang Zemin oversaw that in the 90s, but Hu Jintao initiated those things, Deng Xiaoping initiated those things. The last little bit, besides the South China Sea, which we're not going to get into, is Taiwan. Xi Jinping has told the PLA to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027, to be capable of invading Taiwan by 2027. I just put out a video about the ins and outs of that if you're interested in seeing it. No Soviet collapse. So avoiding the Soviet collapse, which we already discussed a little bit as part of the China Dream for Xi. And here's one that makes it really interesting. The China Dream is partially a full rejection of Hu Jintao's peaceful rise. So part of Xi's China Dream is being more assertive on the international stage. It's about rejecting what Deng Xiaoping said, which is hide your strength, bide your time. That's a famous quote from Deng Xiaoping. Xi Jinping says, no. We're not going to bide our time anymore. Now it's time to be assertive, right? So you get these really aggressive movements in the Taiwan Strait on a scale that we never saw with anyone else. We had, crises in the Taiwan Strait, but we never had anything like we've had under Xi Jinping. But you also see, China showing up in the Arctic in the Xi Jinping era, in the Antarctic. You see him being a power broker in the Ukraine-Russia war. You see him really, really pushing to have BRICS set up an alternative to the dollar, even though it's probably not going to work out. With India, China is no longer sitting back as it was during the Hu Jintao era. It is now fighting what they call hegemonism, that is American encirclement of China effectively in the region, and asserting themselves as a great power. And if you've followed my channel for a while, I talk a lot about great power politics on the global stage. Xi Jinping has played a big role in making that happen because he has said, the years of shame and humiliation, the centuries that China's gone through since the Opium Wars started, the centuries of humiliation in 1841, with the forced opening to free trade of China from the British, through the unequal treaties of the 19th century, through the Japanese occupation of Taiwan, and through the nationalist era, the collapse of the Qing, all that's over now. It is time for China to take the blessings, the gifts of the Mao Deng era. It is time for us to become what we were meant to be by 2050. That's the China Dream. A couple more quick things on Xi Jinping. The surveillance state obviously got to its largest extent, and I've done a video covering that, but China has centralized the surveillance state. So you had the foundations of the Golden Shield Project, that is called in the United States the Great Firewall of China, China's separate internet, the banning of things like Google. You had all that in the Hu Jintao era. But Xi Jinping, when he took power in 2012, said to the party, take the commanding heights of the internet. Don't mess around. So you have the implementation of mass facial recognition technology. You have the decentralized but slowly centralizing system, both public and private, of social credit. That deserves a lot more treatment and subtle discussion I can't get into right here. It exists, but it doesn't really exist in the way that it's portrayed yet. You have the utilization of private companies. Xi Jinping is big on having private tech companies help them build out the Great Firewall, use AI to monitor discussion. There is a book called Outsource Repression by the author Ong. I believe it's 2021 or 2023, covering the ways in which the surveillance state is done, both tactile, as in human resources, like you might have expected from the Stasi v. Germany, and digitally through the Great Firewall, and the monitoring of everyone's internet use on apps and on their cell phones. There's really no escaping from the sensors and the monitoring. And part of this is about building something that's quasi-utopian. That is to say that it's not just about whether China can use the internet and the surveillance state to tamp down defense or dissent. It's about whether they can use the internet to actually build a utopia, to perceive what people need in society before they even know that they need it, to perceive their discontent before they've actually expressed it. Does that sound creepy to you? That's actually a really good place for me to bring up my final point of this video, which is to say that the social contract in China is the overarching thing that you should take away from all this. We've introduced the idea of positive rights. So the idea that the social contract in China is that the Communist Party of China gets universal monopoly on power, and in exchange, the people get material benefits. That's basically what exists left of Marxist-Leninist policy after all these years in China, is that the people should expect the distribution according to their needs and perhaps since the Deng era to their wants. And that is the basic social contract. People get what they want and need. The party gets the universal monopoly on power. The way the Chinese state is developing right now is a tension between, can the surveillance state and this grand centralized control, this rejuvenation that Xi Jinping is building, can it basically achieve people's wants and needs, or can it simply build a repressive enough surveillance system and a repressive enough party system that even if it doesn't achieve its end of the bargain of the social contract, it can remain in power anyway because it has taken so much control of people's thoughts and private lives that there's no going back, right? Is there a point of no return where the party has accumulated so much power that there's no such thing as resistance anymore? This legacy is one that can be seen with like the Uyghurs, where like 1 million people are estimated to be sent to camps for re-education. There are security cameras in classrooms and in Tibetan monasteries. The state is so ubiquitous in China that the question will be, if the demographic crisis brought about by the one-child policy comes, if the growth rates, which in the Xi era have continued to be relatively high, like 5% GDP per year, if that eventually stalls out, or if in general people's lives plateau and the middle income trap actually does trap China and its ascendancy basically stops, has the state built up enough control to prevent a new Tiananmen Square in the cradle, basically kill it before it can even get started? That's kind of the mission of Xi Jinping. And it's dark as hell to even think about, but that is, I believe, the ultimate question for China. However, I am not, and we've talked about the word Sino, right? China. So I'm not xenophobic. I am deeply interested in China. I would not want to live under the Chinese Communist Party. But I think it is worth asking the question that we started with, which is that China is a country, let's say roughly 1 billion people. The official number is 1.4. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty by this institution, the Communist Party of China, or they've lifted it themselves, whatever. Chinese government right now is one that can flood the world with exports. It's the one that can expand its manufacturing base in incredible ways. It is starting to surpass the West in military technology. It has a monopoly on rare earth elements in a way that it can influence the trade war in ways that Europe and the United States were never expecting for some reason, even though it was pretty clear that China had a monopoly on rare earth elements for decades that they've been building. I got a video on that if you're interested on Greenland. The point is that China is extremely powerful. And so my question to you as I end this video talking about all the leaders of China is this: was it worth it? Heads held high. Happy Warriors. Later, y'all.